Tonight we're going somewhere quieter, colder, and much, much harder. No knights, no dragons, no thrones, just muddy boots, aching backs, and survival. This is the world of the medieval peasant, forgotten by history, yet holding up the weight of an entire age. For the next little while, we'll step into their lives. Bound to the land by laws they didn't write. Rising with the church bell, sleeping by smoky firelight. Eating bread so coarse it chipped their teeth, if they were lucky to eat at all. You'll hear about their joys, small and fleeting, their work, their faith, their quiet rebellions, and the legacy they left behind in bones and soil. So before we begin, go ahead and hit like and subscribe if you enjoy these immersive journeys into the past. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. Now breathe in. It's time to remember the people history left behind. The Bound Earth, an introduction to medieval peasant life. The morning fog lifts slowly over the rolling fields of medieval Europe. It doesn't part with haste, nor does it rush to reveal the quiet life that sleeps beneath. It clings to the thatched rooftops, to the furrows in the soil, to the rounded stones of a worn village lane. Somewhere, a rooster calls, not loudly, not triumphantly, but with the steady rhythm of a world that turns not by will, but by the habits of 1,000 yesterdays. In a cottage still heavy with the scent of smoke and wool, a peasant stirs beneath a scratchy woolen blanket. He does not own the blanket. He does not own the roof above his head. He does not own the field he will kneel in by midday. And yet he lives as though he belongs, because he must. Life tethered by obligation. This was the peasant's life in medieval Europe. It was a life tethered not by dreams or freedoms, but by necessity, obligation, and law. The term, bound to the land, was no poetic description, it was a legal state of being. The people who fed the kingdom, who carved furrows in the earth, who sowed grain by hand and harvested it with aching backs, were tied not to a nation, not to an idea, but to a plot of land, and to the lord who ruled it. They were known as serfs, villeins, or simply peasants. Their freedom, if it could be called that, existed only within the margins granted by their lord. They could not leave the manor without permission. They could not choose another trade without risk. Their labor was owed in rent, not coin. And still, they woke each morning, stoked the fire, stepped into their boots, and walked into a life shaped not by ambition, but by repetition. The feudal system that governed their world was not a single law but a vast, tangled net of rights, obligations, and unwritten customs. It was as immovable as the castle that loomed in the distance, a place most peasants would never enter, though it shaped their world like the moon shapes the tide. A lord granted land to his vassals in return for loyalty and military service. The vassals, in turn, parceled out smaller tracts to peasants, who worked it and, in doing so, upheld the entire fragile order of medieval society. Endurance, not ascension. But to truly understand the peasant's place within this system, we must forget the modern ideas of mobility, autonomy, and personal wealth. In the medieval village, one did not rise above. One endured. Life was about survival, not ascension. To till the same land your father did, to pass that duty to your son, that was the expected cycle. No ladder to climb, no ceiling to break, only soil, seasons, and submission. Still, even within this slow, earthen life, there was rhythm and depth. The peasant did not live every day in bitterness. He was not constantly aware of his lack of freedom, because freedom was never truly known. What was known was the turning of the seasons, the tolling of the church bell, the feel of frost in the morning hay. Life was lived through sensation, not ideology. A cracked heel, a full belly, a child's laughter in the lane. These were the measures of a good day. The village itself was not just a place. It was a body, a shared body of labor, breath, and belief. Each cottage, each field, each fence was part of a single, breathing whole. Neighbors depended on one another. If a man's ox fell ill, another might lend his own for the harvest. If a child fell sick, the entire village might pray at mass. There was no luxury of solitude. To be alone in the medieval countryside was not romantic, it was dangerous. Wolves did not ask for permission. Hunger did not care for pride. And yet, Despite this closeness, there was hierarchy. Even among peasants, there were layers. A villein might have more land than a cotter. A reeve might oversee the work of others. Privileges, however minor, were often fiercely guarded. Envy had no place in law but grew like weeds in the cracks between houses. When food was scarce, even kinship strained. Legal bonds and dignity in labor. The legal language of servitude was cold and impersonal. A serf could not marry outside the manor without the lord's consent. If he fled, he could be pursued. If he died, his belongings reverted to the lord. And yet, this was not always enforced with cruelty. Lords were often absent, their power exercised through stewards or bailiffs. The village managed its own disputes more often than not. The manorial court met regularly, not just to punish, but to settle quarrels, record agreements, and keep the quiet order of things. There was dignity in the work, though it was backbreaking. A man who could reap quickly, or thatch well, or train a plow horse was respected. These were not skills, in the modern sense. They were survival crafts, passed through generations, tested not by resumes but by seasons. A mistake in sowing could mean hunger by winter. There was no room for laziness. The earth did not forgive delay. Religion offered comfort, but also chains. The church affirmed the natural order. Kings ruled, lords commanded, and peasants served. This was divine law, not merely social arrangement. The idea that one's station in life was chosen by God offered solace to some, resignation to others. Heaven awaited the patient, the obedient, the humble. Earthly suffering was not meaningless, it was the proving ground for salvation. A poor man's prayer might carry more weight than a bishop's tithe, or so the priest said. Glimmers of longing and enduring legacy. But there were moments, quiet ones, when a peasant may have wondered. Standing in the field as dusk settled, watching the castle's torchlights flicker in the distance, did he wonder what it might be like to ride a horse, to hold a sword, to eat until full? Did the sight of travelers stir a longing he could not name? Perhaps, but that longing had no place to grow. It was buried like seed in stone. The children grew up fast. There was no childhood as we understand it, only stages of usefulness. By the age of 7, a child might herd animals or help in the fields. Education, if it came at all, was limited to scripture and counting. Yet even here, in the dirt and toil, there were moments of joy. The game of ball in the village green, a feast day procession, the sight of spring's first bloom. These were not luxuries. They were lifelines. Peasant life was neither romantic nor uniformly grim. It was textured, a mosaic of effort, resignation, faith, hunger, warmth, and weariness. To survive was to succeed. To reach old age was a small miracle. Most peasants would live and die within a mile of their birthplace, never knowing the feel of foreign soil or the scent of another sea. But they knew their earth. They knew its moods, its demands, its secret rhythms. And though the land did not belong to them, they belonged to it. In the centuries that followed, laws changed. Serfdom would decline, freedom would grow, and peasants would become workers, citizens, names in census rolls. But in the time we now visit, they were something else. Not invisible, not voiceless, but bound. Bound to a place, to a system, to a way of life older than memory. And it is here, among the cracked tiles and muddy lanes of a forgotten village, that our journey begins. Morning to moonrise, a day in the life of a peasant. The sun has not yet risen, but already the village stirs. A rooster's cry pierces the mist, not as a symbol of hope, but as a habit of centuries. The world wakes not with ceremony, but with the rasp of straw-filled mattresses and the crackle of a newly kindled fire. Beneath a thatched roof darkened by years of soot, a peasant family begins its day. The hearth is the heart of their home, though it smokes more than it warms. Ashes are pushed aside, and damp wood laid carefully. Sparks catch, flicker, and rise. In this fragile flame, the day begins. The humble home and sustenance. The cottage is narrow and dark, its walls woven of wattle and daub, patched over time with care and urgency. A wooden bench sits beside the fire, worn smooth by countless evenings. A single window lets in the faintest light, covered with oiled cloth or horn, not glass. The air is heavy with the scents of damp earth, old wool, and last night's cooked barley. Sleepy children rise slowly, tugging on coarse tunics, blinking at the cold. There is no room for privacy. No room, really, for anything but necessity. The animals, chickens, a pig, perhaps even a goat, share the living space, kept in at night for warmth and protection. A simple breakfast follows. Often, it is pottage, leftover grains thickened with water, flavored if one is lucky with a shred of salted meat or a handful of leeks. There is dark bread, hard from the hearth, eaten with slow bites and little waste. A man eats not to enjoy but to endure. He does not linger. The day is already waiting for him in the fields, and the fields do not forgive lateness. Toil in the fields. Outside, the village lane is muddy, rutted with the imprints of cartwheels and bare feet. Dew clings to the thatch above, and crows wheel silently over the fallow pastures. The manor's bell may sound to mark the hour, though many peasants keep time by the sky. The Lord's reeve might already be making rounds, ensuring that the day's tasks are underway. A missed duty could mean a fine. Too many fines might mean losing a strip of land or a season's grain. There is no cushion in peasant life. Each day is part of a careful, unbroken thread. The fields are arranged in long, narrow strips. One man does not own a single plot, but several scattered furlongs, rotated with the seasons to maintain the soil's strength. He will work his own land today, and tomorrow he will owe labor on the Lord's demesne, fields held directly by the manor. The tools are basic: a wooden plow, often pulled by oxen, a sickle for reaping, a mattock for breaking soil. They are handed down like names, patched and re-sharpened as needed. Labor begins with the lifting of the fog. In spring, it is the sowing of barley and oats. In summer, the relentless weeding and the mending of fences. Autumn brings the harvest, an all-consuming effort that stretches from dawn to dusk. Winter does not offer rest, only different labors: firewood gathering, tool repair, spinning wool, and slaughtering livestock if any were fattened enough to spare. Each day has its rhythm, but the rhythm is dictated by the land and by necessity. Men and women work side by side, often with children trailing behind. A young girl scatters seed, her palms raw from yesterday's nettles. A boy chases birds from the field, his voice hoarse from the cold wind. These children are not idle hands. They are essential. By 10, many will contribute more to survival than some adults. Formal schooling, where it exists, is reserved for boys of means, taught by monks behind cloistered walls. For the peasant child, the book is the field, and the lesson is in survival. Midday reprieve and daily challenges. Midday comes with little pause. Lunch, if it can be called that, is often a hunk of bread and a bit of cheese, carried in a cloth from home. A jug of weak ale is passed between hands. Water, though available from nearby streams or village wells, is not always trusted. Ale is brewed weak but safe, a habit that passes through generations without question. There is little talk during meals, only the sound of chewing and the low groan of muscles resting. A brief reprieve, and then back to labor. By afternoon, the sun has grown strong, and the air is thick with the smells of sweat and soil. A farmer wipes his brow with a ragged sleeve, eyes squinting at the clouds that gather on the horizon. He knows the signs. He reads the weather not with instruments but with memory. A sudden rain might ruin a day's work. A dry spell might doom a harvest. The land speaks, and the peasant listens, not with words, but with every muscle, every scar, every calloused hand. Back in the village, those not in the fields attend to other tasks. A mother stirs pottage in the cauldron while spinning wool on a drop spindle. A boy feeds scraps to the pig, careful not to let it wander. A girl scours the cooking pot with sand and cold water. Chores are constant. Clothes must be mended, floors swept with birch brooms, thatch patched against leaks. Evenings bring a temporary stillness, but there is no true rest, only moments without demand. Nightfall and enduring hope. When the sun lowers behind the hills and the fields fall into shadow, the village exhales. Work slows. Feet shuffle home along the lane, heavier than they were in the morning. At the cottage, the hearth is coaxed back to life, and a thicker pottage is made from the day's bits: barley, onions, cabbage, sometimes beans, rarely meat. The family gathers close around the low table, their bodies hunched not from sorrow, but from wear. They eat with fingers, from shared bowls. The fire's crackle fills the silence, the flames casting flickers of gold on the walls. There is no candlelight. Tallow is expensive, reserved for feast days or the church. Instead, rushlights burn, strips of rush plant dipped in fat, set in an iron holder. They give off a dim, wavering glow and a faint odor. But it is enough. Enough to see the shape of a father's face, creased and kind. Enough to light the eyes of a mother as she sings softly to the babe in her arms. After supper, there is a small window for something softer. A song, a tale, a whispered memory. Perhaps an elder recounts the legend of a wandering knight, or a mother tells the story of St. Cuthbert and the sea otters. These are not idle entertainments. They are oral inheritance, the thread that binds past to present. Stories are more than diversion. They are legacy. The fire dies low. Children curl against their parents. Blankets are thin, but bodies huddle for warmth. Outside, the night creatures stir. Foxes, owls, the occasional howl from the woods. But inside, there is peace. A hard-won, imperfect peace. The day has been survived. That is the measure of success. And so the cycle continues. Each day a mirror of the last, each night a repetition of survival. In a world where freedom is a dream for another class, another age, there is still rhythm, still meaning, still the quiet dignity of labor completed. Morning to moonrise, over and again. The peasant's day is not remarkable, but it is enduring, and in that endurance, there is a kind of strength. A life not chosen freely, but lived fully nonetheless. The seasons of the soil, farming as a sacred cycle. In the quiet dawn of a medieval village, the earth breathes beneath a veil of mist. Soft tendrils of fog cling to the furrows in the soil, and the first light touches the thatched rooftops and the humble fields stretching beyond. For the peasants who call this land home, their lives unfold inextricably bound to the seasons, a cycle as old as the soil itself. To survive was to become one with this rhythm, for the land was not merely property or resource, it was sacred, a living force that demanded respect, vigilance, and an unyielding labor. The open field system and crop rotation. The heart of medieval peasant life was the field, vast stretches of open land divided into strips, painstakingly cultivated with hand tools and animal power. The open field system, practiced widely across Europe, shaped not only the landscape but the very fabric of community life. Each family held a few narrow strips scattered across the fields, a patchwork pattern designed to share both fertile and less productive ground. This distribution fostered mutual reliance. The peasants were tied to one another as tightly as they were to the land. Central to the success of their farming was the practice of crop rotation, a system vital to maintaining the health of the soil. Rather than exhausting the earth by planting the same crop repeatedly, medieval peasants divided the arable land into 3 parts. 1/3 was sown with winter grains such as rye or wheat, planted in autumn and harvested the following summer. Another third was reserved for spring crops like oats, barley, or legumes, sown after the winter fields were cleared. The final third lay fallow, untouched, to allow the soil to rest and regain its nutrients. This pattern, repeated year after year, was a silent pact with nature, an acknowledgement that the earth needed time to heal, just as the people needed time to endure. Tools, labor, and the rhythm of the year. The tools of farming were humble but essential extensions of the peasant's body and will. The moldboard plow, a technological breakthrough of the early medieval period, allowed the turning of the heavy, clay-rich soils of northern Europe, making previously untillable land productive. Drawn by oxen, slow but powerful, or horses, which became more common as harness technology improved, the plow cut deep furrows, aerating the earth and burying weeds in old crops. Each pass carved long ridges and valleys, the now iconic ridge and furrow pattern still visible centuries later, a lasting testament to this tireless labor. But even with the plow's help, the work was grueling. Peasants rose with the sun to till, sow, weed, and harvest, their bodies aching and clothes stained with the earth's dust. The rhythm of their days and weeks was dictated by the seasons. Spring was a time of hope and hard work, as the ground thawed and the seedbeds were prepared. The fields were sown carefully, row by row, with hands that knew every stone and root. Summer brought vigilance. Crops had to be protected from weeds, pests, and the caprices of weather. The threat of drought loomed large, and every drop of water was precious. When autumn arrived, it brought the harvest, an all-consuming effort that stretched from dawn to dusk. The ripe ears of wheat and barley were cut with sickles and scythes, bundled into sheaves and carried home. The entire village often came together for the harvest, their hands working in unison, their voices lifted in prayers and songs. Among the sheaves, one special bundle, the Harvest Queen, was fashioned and kept as a talisman until the next planting, a symbol of the earth's generosity and the hope for renewal. Sacred observances and enduring challenges. Yet the farming year was not merely a cycle of toil. It was a sacred journey punctuated by religious observance and communal rites. The medieval calendar was a tapestry woven with saints' days, feast days, and holy festivals, each holding meaning for the peasant's life and work. Lammas Day, celebrated on August 1st, marked the beginning of the wheat harvest. Loaves made from the new grain were blessed in church, a ritual blending the earthly and the divine, reminding the community that their survival depended not only on their hands but on the grace of God. Similarly, Michaelmas in late September marked the end of the harvest and the time to settle accounts and rent. These observances were moments of pause, a chance to reflect on the intertwined fate of man, land, and spirit. Despite all the care and ritual, nature's unpredictability was an ever-present shadow. A late frost could kill tender shoots, too much rain could drown seeds, a dry summer could parch fields. Harvests could fail, and with them, the fragile security of the peasant family. To confront these uncertainties, peasants turned to a blend of faith and folklore. Agricultural charms and blessings were common: prayers to saints, symbols carved on plows, rituals performed during planting and harvest. In many villages, superstitions flourished alongside Christian belief, as an additional hedge against the capriciousness of weather and soil. Livestock and the cycle's enduring meaning. Animals were vital to the farming cycle, their roles woven deeply into daily life. Oxen were prized for their strength and endurance, capable of pulling heavy plows through dense soil. Horses, though faster and more expensive to maintain, grew in number as improved harnessing techniques spread. Sheep provided wool, the raw material for clothing that shielded peasants from cold and wet, while pigs, allowed to roam the woods, provided meat and fat essential for winter sustenance. Cattle and goats supplied milk and cheese, rounding out a diet that was modest but varied within the constraints of peasant life. As the sun sank low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the fields, the peasant's day came to a close. The work of the earth never truly ceased. The cycle would begin anew with the changing of the seasons, but the evening brought rest, meals shared by candlelight, and the soft warmth of hearth fires. Here, stories of past harvests, saints' miracles, and old family tales flickered into life, binding the community with memory and hope. To be a medieval peasant was to live within the embrace of this sacred cycle, tied by law and custom to a patch of earth that defined their existence. Though bound by duty and often hardship, peasants found meaning in the land's rhythms, a profound connection that shaped their identity and anchored their fragile lives. Through their hands, the seasons turned, and life endured, an enduring testament to the sacred dance between human and soil, survival and faith, hardship and hope. The village bond: family, neighbors, and shared survival. In the heart of the medieval countryside, beyond the vast fields and the hedgerows that marked the boundaries of lordly estates, lay the village, a cluster of humble homes gathered close, like survivors huddling against the vast unknown. Here, the lives of peasants were woven tightly together, bound not only by duty to the land but by a network of shared hardship, kinship, and necessity. The village was a small world unto itself, where survival depended on the fragile trust and interdependence between family, neighbors, and community. The family unit, foundation of survival. Within the close quarters of a medieval village, family was the foundation. Houses were modest, often 1 or 2 rooms, where multiple generations lived under the same thatched roof. Children played in the dirt paths while elders labored beside them, their hands steady but weathered by time. The family was both a working unit and a social sanctuary, a source of labor, care, and the preservation of traditions. Each member had a role. Men and older boys tended the fields or animals. Women prepared meals, spun wool, and cared for the children. The elderly passed down stories, wisdom, and religious faith. Communal labor and shared resources. Yet the family alone could not meet the overwhelming demands of rural life. From the earliest dawn until the fading twilight, cooperation was essential. Villages operated with a shared economy of resources and labor that shaped every aspect of peasant existence. One of the most vivid examples was the communal oven, often a single, large brick or clay structure that served the entire settlement. Bread, the staple of the peasant diet, was not baked in individual homes but in this shared oven, a place where neighbors gathered, exchanged news, and took turns tending the fire. The act of baking together became a moment of connection and reliance, a small but vital link in the chain of survival. Collective labor extended far beyond ovens. The agricultural calendar dictated seasons of intense cooperation. During plowing, planting, and harvest, peasants joined forces to tackle tasks too great for any one family. Fields were tilled in concert, seeds scattered, and crops gathered with hands working side by side. These moments forged bonds of solidarity but also reinforced obligations. The village was a system of mutual aid, where help given today would be repaid in kind tomorrow. The village functioned as a delicate ecosystem, balancing generosity with duty, neighborliness with the unspoken pressures of shared fate. Seasonal traditions and emotional support. Seasonal traditions punctuated the village year, creating rhythm and respite amidst hardship. Festivals like Michaelmas and Lammas marked not just religious occasions but community milestones, times when peasants could come together to celebrate the fruits of their labor, exchange gifts, and renew social ties. In some regions, the harvest feast brought music, dancing, and the telling of stories, a vital antidote to the relentless toil. These traditions were woven into daily life like threads of gold, binding the community's past to its present, and imbuing ordinary days with meaning. Reliance on kin and neighbor was more than practical, it was emotional and spiritual. In a world where illness, injury, and death were constant threats, the village was a place where care was shared and grief was collective. Neighbors helped tend the sick, watched children, and supported widows and orphans. The local priest, often living nearby, acted as a spiritual anchor and sometimes as a mediator, helping maintain peace and order. In times of disaster, whether a failed harvest, disease outbreak, or raid, villagers pulled together, their lives tightly interwoven by necessity and compassion. Fragile trust and enduring identity. Trust, however, was fragile. The pressures of poverty, legal obligation, and fear of famine could strain relationships. Disputes over land boundaries, water rights, or labor duties were common, and villagers often had a delicate balance between cooperation and conflict. The manorial court, held by the Lord Steward or bailiff, was a place where grievances were aired and resolved, reinforcing the authority of the Lord but also protecting the community's fragile equilibrium. This system kept the village in a state of uneasy harmony, where each person understood their place and responsibility. The village was also a repository of memory and identity. Oral tradition flourished here, passed down from one generation to the next through stories, songs, and legends. These tales recalled the origins of the village, the deeds of ancestors, and the lessons of survival against the harshness of nature and the weight of authority. The stories were a balm for weary souls and a quiet act of resistance, a way for peasants to claim a shared humanity beyond their status as bound laborers. In this communal world, individual freedom was scarce, but the village offered a form of belonging and support that was vital to endurance. The bonds forged in the soil, the hearth, and the fields formed a living web, fragile, yes, but resilient enough to carry countless generations through hardship. The peasants' lives, though marked by servitude and scarcity, were also filled with moments of shared joy, mutual aid, and quiet dignity. To understand the medieval peasant is to see beyond the harsh labels of bondage and poverty, and to recognize the richness of community life that sustained them. The village was more than a place, it was a living organism, a collective heart beating in time with the seasons and the land. In the shadows of lords and laws, peasants found strength in each other, weaving survival from the threads of family, neighborliness, and shared hope. God above, earth below, the peasants' religion. In the quiet heart of every medieval village, the church towered, both literally and metaphorically, above all else. Its weathered stone walls, its stained glass windows catching the light of the sun, and the low, steady tolling of its bells marked not just the passage of hours but the very rhythm of peasant life. To the medieval peasant, religion was not a mere facet of existence but the very framework through which the world was understood. It shaped the seasons, dictated behavior, and framed every joy and sorrow with meaning. The peasants' lives were inseparable from the sacred. God was above, watching, judging, and offering grace. The earth was below, fertile yet unforgiving, demanding toil and obedience. The church's constant presence. Each day was punctuated by the voice of the church bells, their chimes carrying across the fields and hamlets. The sound summoned peasants from their labor, reminding them to pause and turn their thoughts heavenward. The Angelus bell rang 3 times daily, at dawn, midday, and evening, inviting prayer and reflection. For peasants, this call was a lifeline, a reminder that their grueling days were woven into a grander divine plan. It was as though these bells bridged 2 worlds, the harsh reality of dirt and toil, and the promise of spiritual peace. The church calendar was a tapestry of feast days and holy observances, many of which transformed the village's daily grind into moments of collective ritual and celebration. Saints' feast days were especially significant, enlivening the community with processions, special masses, and often the sharing of stories and legends about the miracles associated with those saints. In some villages, the patron saint's day was the most awaited time of the year, a pause in work, a time for communal meals, and the renewal of bonds among neighbors. Children might be given small gifts, adults might dress in their best, and the village square might fill with music, dance, and laughter. Sin, salvation, and the priest's role. Yet this celebration was shadowed by the ever-present weight of sin and salvation. The medieval church taught that all humans were born stained with original sin, their souls vulnerable to corruption unless cleansed through confession and good works. Fear of eternal damnation was a constant companion in peasant minds, a spectral threat hovering behind every misdeed, every harsh word, every failure to fulfill one's duties. Confession, therefore, was both a fearful and necessary ritual. Kneeling before the priest in the dim light of the church, the peasant confessed sins, both minor and grievous, hoping for absolution but aware that penance would follow. This penance might be fasting, prayers, or acts of charity, reinforcing the church's moral authority and its deep hold over peasant lives. The village priest was a figure of paradox, both revered and distant, a man who embodied spiritual authority but also one who lived within the same small world of the peasants. Often the only literate man in the community, the priest was charged with administering the sacraments that marked the key moments of life: baptism, which cleansed the infant's soul and welcomed the child into the church; marriage, which bound couples together under God's law; the last rites, which prepared the dying for their passage to the afterlife. Beyond these sacred duties, the priest often served as a counselor, healer, and mediator. He might settle disputes, offer advice on matters both spiritual and practical, or tend to the sick with prayers and herbal remedies. Despite his closeness to the people, the priest's position was vulnerable. He answered to the Lord who owned the land and to distant bishops whose priorities might be far removed from village concerns. Blending beliefs, superstition and pilgrimage. Superstition and folklore mingled freely with Orthodox Christian belief, revealing the layered spirituality of peasants. They believed the natural world was infused with signs and portents, rainbows, eclipses, unusual animal behavior, all interpreted as messages from God. Weather was a divine language, and a good harvest a blessing to be earned through prayer and sacrifice. Healing was often sought through a combination of Christian rites and folk remedies, prayers to saints, the use of holy water, combined with charms, amulets, and herbs passed down through generations. This synthesis of faith and folklore gave peasants a measure of control in an unpredictable world, a way to plead with divine powers while respecting ancestral wisdom. Pilgrimage was a powerful expression of medieval devotion, though it was a rare privilege for peasants. Journeying to a distant shrine or relic, a saint's bones, a holy icon, or a site of miraculous healing, was a pilgrimage of faith, penance, and hope. These journeys were long, arduous, and fraught with danger. Travel was slow, roads were perilous, and bandits were ever-present threats. Yet for some peasants, the promise of spiritual renewal and the chance to receive divine favor outweighed these hardships. The idea of pilgrimage also shaped the imagination of those who could not undertake the journey. Stories of famous shrines and miraculous healings passed from traveler to traveler, fueling dreams of connection to the sacred beyond their village boundaries. Daily symbolism and enduring comfort. Daily life was rich with religious symbolism. Crosses carved into doorways and fences, statues of saints placed near the hearth, and painted icons in the fields served as constant reminders of divine presence. These sacred objects were believed to protect the household, the crops, and the animals from harm. In the harsh reality of medieval life, where famine, disease, and violence were common, faith was a fragile but vital thread holding the community together. The church's presence was a source of order and meaning, but also of discipline, reinforcing social hierarchies and the peasant's place within them. Religion offered a bittersweet comfort. It explained the cruelty of life as part of God's plan, teaching that suffering on earth was a test or punishment but also a passage to a better life after death. The promise of heaven, a place free from pain, labor, and sorrow, was the ultimate hope. The fear of hell, by contrast, was a stark warning that the soul's fate depended on obedience, piety, and good works. In this way, religion intertwined with social control, shaping behavior through the powerful mix of hope and fear. In moments of festival and worship, however, this heavy framework lifted. Communal celebrations, singing hymns, hearing the rich chants of the Mass, and the glow of candles and incense created experiences of transcendence. These moments allowed peasants to feel part of something greater than their individual struggles, connected to a divine narrative that promised meaning beyond the immediate hardships. The church was not merely a building, it was the spiritual heart of the village, a place where heaven and earth met. Through centuries of hardship, through famine, war, and plague, faith sustained the medieval peasant. Bound to the land and bound by duty, the peasant found the religion both the yoke of obligation and the wings of hope. God above, watching and waiting, earth below, demanding and unforgiving. This was the balance of medieval peasant life, a delicate dance between despair and faith that shaped their world in every breath. The only joys, feasts, festivals, and forgotten celebrations. Amid the endless cycle of toil and the heavy weight of unyielding duty, the medieval peasant's life was a landscape marked by fleeting moments of joy, brief, shimmering windows of light that illuminated the otherwise shadowed existence. These were the holy days, the festivals, the communal feasts, occasions that seemed almost suspended in time, where the boundaries between work and play, hardship and happiness, loosened just enough to allow a glimpse of freedom. Though these celebrations were fleeting and rare, their significance was profound, shaping the rhythms of the year and the memories of those who lived through them. Lifelines of joy and community. The medieval calendar was punctuated by dozens of feast days, many tied to the church's liturgical year, where the solemnity of worship mingled with the earthly delight of communal gathering. These were days when the village breathed as one, when shared traditions rose like smoke from hearths and fields, filling the air with the scent of roasting meat and the sound of laughter. The village, usually marked by hushed focus and laborious activity, transformed into a stage of exuberance. Villagers donned their best, even if their best was simply the cleanest worn wool or linen they could muster. Children ran free, their voices piercing the gentle hum of celebration. One such festival was May Day, a day marked by fertility rites and the celebration of spring's arrival. The maypole stood tall in the village green, a towering wooden pillar decorated with garlands of flowers, ribbons streaming in vibrant colors like the laughter of youth itself. The dance around the maypole was not simply a game but a ritual, a weaving of community and nature, of hope for a fruitful year ahead. Men and women, young and old, would clasp the ribbons, their steps moving in intricate patterns, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, echoing the unpredictability of the earth they depended on. These dances were more than mere entertainment. They were affirmations of life itself, of continuity and renewal. The collective rhythm of the dancers seemed to pull the very soil into harmony, inviting the blessing of the land, the rain, and the sun. Folk songs accompanied the dances, sung in voices raw and pure, telling stories passed from generation to generation, tales of love and loss, of saints and sinners, of mythical beasts and heroic ancestors. These songs connected the living to their past, anchoring them in a shared identity even as their lives remained fragile. Rare indulgences and shared sustenance. Feasts on these days offered a rare indulgence. Medieval peasants' diets were modest and repetitive for most of the year: coarse bread, pottage, and whatever vegetables the earth reluctantly yielded. But on feast days, a different aroma filled the air. If luck was kind and the Lord generous, there might be roasted meats, a rare luxury such as pork or mutton, accompanied by fresh butter and cheese. Ale, the common drink, flowed more freely, its rich, yeasty scent blending with the smoke of hearth fires. Even the poorest might taste something sweet, such as honey or dried fruits, luxuries that seemed to whisper of another world beyond the fields. Food was never merely sustenance, it was a symbol of abundance and community. The long tables arranged in the open air or in the village hall became places of storytelling and connection, where villagers exchanged news, sang songs, and reconnected after seasons of grueling labor. The laughter that spilled from these gatherings was like a balm, a reminder that even in the harshest times, humanity persisted. Children's games unfolded nearby, chasing, tumbling, their joy unburdened by the future's weight. Festivals were also times for games and contests, wrestling matches, archery, foot races, and even mock battles that allowed young men to show strength and skill. These games were not only entertainment but served a social purpose, reinforcing status and forging bonds. Winners gained respect, and sometimes tokens or small prizes were awarded. These rituals reminded everyone of the virtues valued by the community: endurance, courage, skill, virtues needed to survive in a world where both nature and man posed constant threats. Bittersweet celebrations and enduring spirit. Yet, despite their vibrancy, these joys were always temporary. The festival's light cast long shadows, for the peasant knew the dance would soon end, the tables would be cleared, and the work would resume at dawn. This awareness lent the celebrations a bittersweet quality, a reminder that while freedom might touch the soul, it never fully took hold. The land still owned the peasant, the seasons still demanded their tribute. And so the feast days were treasured all the more for their impermanence. Beyond the well-known church festivals, many villages held local customs now largely forgotten, rites and celebrations passed down through centuries, tied closely to the rhythms of the land. These might include the blessing of the fields in spring, the lighting of bonfires at the solstice, or the weaving of harvest wreaths to honor the earth's generosity. These rituals were deeply woven into peasant life, a sacred choreography that balanced the practical with the mystical. In these moments, the veil between the natural and supernatural seemed thin, and the peasants felt themselves part of a larger cosmic dance. The role of the Lord in these festivals was complex. Lords often sponsored or controlled these events, using them as tools to reinforce their power and benevolence. A lord's generosity at a feast could enhance loyalty and mitigate unrest, and so peasants watched these gestures with wary gratitude. Sometimes the lord would lead the dances or the processions, embodying his position as both ruler and protector. Yet beneath this hierarchy, the peasants found space for genuine communal joy, carving out moments where they might forget their place in the rigid social order. The church also played a central role in shaping festival life. Masses and processions gave religious meaning to the celebrations, linking the sacred and the secular. Saints' relics might be paraded through the streets. Prayers were said for the health of the crops and the safety of the village. These ceremonies, rich in symbolism and pageantry, reminded peasants that their struggles were part of a divine plan and that the saints watched over them as guardians and intercessors. For medieval peasants, festivals were a complex weave of faith, tradition, social structure, and release. They were the only moments when the burden of servitude seemed to lighten, when community and celebration carved out a refuge from the endless demands of land and lord. These celebrations were a reminder of shared humanity, a fleeting taste of joy, and an anchor in a world defined by hardship. And so, as the firelight flickered on faces worn by sun and toil, as the sound of fiddles and pipes filled the village square, the peasants danced and sang with an intensity born of knowing that this light would fade. But in those moments, even bound to the land and their duty, they found a way to live fully, to claim joy as a quiet rebellion, to weave hope into the fabric of survival. Mud, straw, and smoke, inside the peasant home. Step quietly through the low doorway of a medieval peasant's home. The threshold is barely taller than a child's reach, reminding you immediately that this world is built on humility and necessity rather than comfort or grandeur. Beyond it lies a small, dim space filled with the scent of smoke, earth, and the faint sweetness of straw. The cottage is built from the simplest materials: wattle and daub walls patched with mud, a thatched roof woven thick with reeds, and a floor beaten hard from generations of footfalls, its surface uneven and earthy underfoot. The central hearth and simple living. Inside, the air carries a perpetual haze, the soft swirl of smoke drifting from the open hearth at the center of the room. This hearth is the heart of the home, its warmth a fragile defense against the chill of the seasons. There is no chimney to whisk the smoke away. Instead, it lingers, threading its way through the thatch and venting slowly through the cracks in the roof. The peasant family endures this smoky veil, eyes stinging at times, but grateful for the fire's life-giving warmth. The cottage is sparse, stripped down to bare essentials. Heavy wooden beams, blackened by time and fire, frame the low ceiling. Rough-hewn benches line the walls, some topped with worn cloth scraps or bundles of dried herbs hanging overhead. A crudely made table sits near the hearth, scarred with knife marks and stains from countless meals. In one corner, a pile of straw serves as a makeshift mattress, a thin blanket folded neatly beside it, offering the only softness in this austere room. Chickens cluck and shuffle across the floor, sharing the space with the family. They are not pets but practical creatures, sources of eggs and occasional meat. The chickens' feathers brush the ankles of children playing or helping with chores, their movements blending into the rhythm of daily life. Occasionally, a mouse or rat scurries unseen, a reminder of the constant battle to protect what little food the family manages to keep. Faith, fragility, and community bonds. The walls are bare except for a few personal touches, a faded religious icon or a crudely painted cross, a simple wooden crucifix. These artifacts speak of faith deeply intertwined with daily existence. They are talismans against misfortune, silent witnesses to prayers whispered in the dark. The small space holds more than physical objects. It holds stories, memories, and a profound resilience born of necessity. The domestic life within these walls is cramped and noisy. Family members share the close quarters, their lives intertwined in a daily dance of cooperation and occasional conflict. Privacy is a luxury unknown here. The air is thick with the smells of cooking, sweat, animal musk, and the musty scent of damp straw and earth. Yet within this closeness lies intimacy, the comfort of shared struggles and small triumphs, the quiet bonds forged in the forge of survival. The hearth fire is used for more than warmth. It is the village's communal kitchen, where pots of pottage simmer over the flames, filling the air with the aroma of whatever root vegetables, grains, or herbs can be found. Food preparation is a constant task, requiring skill and patience to coax sustenance from the meager ingredients. Peasant cooks knew well the value of every scrap, turning leftovers into nourishing broths, and saving seeds from the harvest for the next planting. By night, the hearth's glow softens the edges of the room, casting flickering shadows that dance across walls lined with hanging tools, wooden spoons, a mortar and pestle, simple knives. These implements are the extensions of hands hardened by labor, each telling its own story of daily use. Even the smallest objects bear the imprint of necessity and thrift. There is no room for waste or luxury in this world. Children's joy and enduring spirit. The children, their cheeks flushed from outdoor play and fresh air, cluster close to the fire when cold. Their clothes are homespun and patched, practical rather than pretty, often damp from rain or dew. Yet despite the hardships, there is laughter here, bursts of youthful energy that ripple through the room and remind all who live here that even in hardship, life insists on its fullness. The sounds of the home are a constant hum, the crackle of fire, the murmur of voices speaking softly in the local dialect, the rhythmic tapping of a wooden tool, or the occasional cluck of a chicken. At times, the night is pierced by the cry of a newborn or the coughing of an elder. These sounds weave into the fabric of the home, marking the passage of days and the cycles of life. Despite its simplicity and harshness, the peasant home was a sanctuary of sorts, the only place where the family's identity was fully theirs, where traditions were passed down by the warmth of the hearth and the telling of stories in the flickering light. It was here that the seeds of community took root, nurtured by shared meals, shared hardships, and shared dreams of a better tomorrow. Yet, the home was also a symbol of confinement, a physical reflection of the peasant's social station. It was modest because the peasant was modest in the eyes of law and lord, bound to the land and to a life of service. The house was not just a dwelling but a reminder of limits, the limits of freedom, wealth, and opportunity. The narrowness of the space mirrored the narrowness of the peasant's world. In winter months, the hearth fire was a flickering beacon against the long cold nights, but the smoke and cold could not be fully kept at bay. Illness spread easily in these close quarters. A cough or fever could turn deadly without the medicines and care that wealthier classes might afford. The peasants depended on herbs, prayers, and simple remedies passed down through generations. The cottage was a place of both life and vulnerability, a fragile haven in a harsh world. This is the world that shaped medieval peasants, homes built of mud, straw, and smoke, where every day was a test of endurance and every night a chance for rest. The peasant's home was a crucible of survival and belonging, a place where the weight of freedom's absence was felt but where the human spirit, through family, faith, and community, quietly endured. Bread, pottage, and hunger, what the peasant ate. The table of a medieval peasant, if it can even be called a table, was a humble and rough-hewn affair, often nothing more than a plank of wood set upon blocks or simple trestles. It bore no ornate finery, no abundance of dishes or silverware. Instead, it carried the simple, repetitive fare that sustained a family tethered to the soil and the endless demands of their lord. Their food was a reflection of their world, hard, unforgiving, yet somehow sustaining. It was plain and earthy, shaped by the land's limits and the narrow margins of survival. The heart of the diet, bread and pottage. At the very heart of the peasant's diet was bread. Yet this bread was not the soft, white loaves familiar to modern tables or even the golden wheat bread enjoyed by nobility. Instead, peasant bread was dense and heavy, dark as the soil itself. Made primarily from rye or barley, grains hardier and more resilient to the northern climates and poorer soils than wheat, the bread was coarse and often gritty. The milling was done on stone querns by hand, uneven and slow, leaving the flour less refined and full of bran and husks. The resulting bread was a hard slab, nutty, bitter, and filling. Sometimes the bread was baked in communal ovens, but often it was simply cooked on hot stones or griddles over the hearth. This bread was not savored but torn roughly by hand and dipped repeatedly into the day's pottage, the thick, slow-cooked stew that was the cornerstone of every peasant meal. Pottage was the simmering essence of peasant sustenance, a hearty but humble concoction. It was cooked in heavy pots over open fires, sometimes stirred with wooden spoons passed down through generations. The contents were whatever the family could grow, gather, or afford. Root vegetables were common: turnips, parsnips, carrots, onions, and leeks, all slow-cooked until they melted into the broth. Beans and peas, rich in protein, were vital additions, while cabbage and kale, hardy greens that thrived even in poor soils, added bulk and vitamins. Occasionally, if the family had a luckier season or hunted successfully, small pieces of salted pork, bacon, or even dried fish might enrich the pot. But meat was rare, usually saved for feast days or when the Lord provided a communal hunt. The flavor of pottage was muted and earthy, as spices were costly and largely out of reach for common folk. Salt, too, was precious and rationed carefully. In some regions, herbs such as parsley, sage, or wild garlic might be gathered to add subtle flavor or medicinal benefits, but these were small luxuries in an otherwise stark diet. The texture was thick and uneven, sometimes muddy in appearance, reflecting the humble origins of its ingredients and the modest means of those who consumed it. Despite its simplicity, pottage was vital. It was both sustenance and comfort, a warm ritual at the end of backbreaking days. Beverages and the constant shadow of hunger. Water was a drink to be approached with caution. Wells could be contaminated, and rivers polluted by nearby villages or animals. Instead, peasants more often drank ale or weak beer, brewed at home or purchased cheaply at local inns or markets. This ale was not the strong spirit we might imagine, but a low-alcohol, nourishing liquid, safer than most water sources and providing much-needed calories. It was an everyday drink, quenching thirst and warming the body during long hours of toil. The brewing of ale was often a woman's task, tightly woven into the rhythms of domestic life and seasonal chores. Yet hunger was an ever-present shadow at the peasant's table. The fortunes of a family hinged on weather, harvest yields, taxation, and the demands of their lord. Poor summers, early frosts, or excessive levies could mean the difference between a full stomach and starvation. Famine was a cruel visitor, often returning with little warning, sweeping through villages and leaving behind devastation. It was a reality that shaped every meal, every seed saved for planting, every root pulled from the earth. Families became adept at stretching their food, drying herbs and vegetables, preserving grains in granaries, and brewing every last kernel into nourishing drinks. The peasant kitchen was a place of constant ingenuity, born of necessity and sometimes desperation. Meals were taken quickly, often in silence, as energy was precious and the work of the fields or home demanded full attention. The act of eating was utilitarian, not a time for leisure or celebration. Children were fed smaller portions, sometimes barely enough, as adults prioritized the strongest bodies for labor. The fleeting moments of rest given by a meal were sacred, yet always overshadowed by the relentless cycle of work and survival. Taste, treats, and nutritional realities. The food's texture and taste mirrored the peasant's existence, rough, unrefined, and marked by endurance. There was little room for indulgence, no place for elaborate feasts or exotic flavors. Food was fuel, a necessary machine oil keeping worn bodies moving through exhaustion and hardship. Yet, within this starkness was a profound connection to the earth, the seasons, and the ever-turning wheel of life and death that governed medieval existence. Occasionally, the monotony of bread and pottage was broken by small treats. Wild berries, gathered from nearby woods in summer, brought fleeting sweetness. A handful of nuts might be cracked open as a rare snack. Cheese made from the family's goats or cows was a small luxury, salty and crumbly, and eggs from the coop were treasured for their rarity and protein. These were small moments of joy, brief flickers of light in a life often overshadowed by scarcity and toil. They were reminders that even in the strict confines of medieval peasant life, there were moments of sweetness and delight. Grains served many purposes beyond bread. They fed the family, certainly, but they also fed livestock, pigs, chickens, and sometimes cattle, vital for a peasant's survival and wealth. Grain was the currency of barter, exchanged at markets for tools, cloth, or other necessities. This interconnected relationship between seed, soil, animal, and human was the fabric of peasant life. Each grain was precious, each meal a small act of balance between survival and ruin. Yet the peasant diet, simple and frugal as it was, shaped not just survival but health and strength. Nutritional deficiencies were widespread. Lack of vitamin C brought scurvy, anemia was common from poor iron intake, and diseases born of malnutrition claimed many lives, especially during harsh winters. Life expectancy was short by modern standards, and common illnesses often turned deadly due to weakened bodies. Still, the peasant's body was resilient, conditioned by years of backbreaking labor, their muscles hardened and endurance remarkable. Their strength was a testament to human tenacity amid relentless hardship. To eat as a medieval peasant was to participate in a profound, ongoing relationship with the land, the seasons, and the social order. Their meals were not mere nutrition but a marker of identity, people tied to the soil, bound by obligation and the unyielding cycle of sowing, harvesting, and survival. Bread and pottage were not just food but symbols of a life marked by labor and limited freedom. In this slow, reflective understanding of peasant food, we see beyond mere hunger or poverty. We glimpse a life intertwined with the earth, shaped by nature's gifts and cruel whims. The humble meal at the peasant's table becomes a quiet story of endurance, a testament that even in scarcity, humanity finds a way to persist, to nurture life, and to carve out moments of joy amidst hardship. Cloaks of dirt, clothing and the mark of labor. In the world of medieval peasants, clothing was never about fashion or frivolity. It was a necessity born of survival and marked unmistakably by the harsh realities of labor and social standing. Every garment worn was a reflection of the wearer's place in the rigid social order, a symbol of their unyielding toil, their connection to the land, and the limited freedoms they possessed. The clothes of a peasant were cloaks of dirt, stitched together from rough wool and patched with care, carrying the weight of daily labor and the harshness of the seasons. The all-encompassing nature of wool. The predominant fabric of the era was wool, spun and woven by hand from the fleece of sheep that grazed on the windswept commons. Unlike the fine, soft wools worn by nobility or clergy, peasant wool was thick, scratchy, and often dyed in muted earth tones, grays, browns, faded greens, colors drawn from the environment rather than from expensive dyes. The woolen cloak, a staple of peasant attire, was not merely a garment but a shield against cold, rain, and biting winds. It was heavy with the grime of the fields, matted with mud after storms, and stiff with the cold dew of early mornings. Undergarments, when worn, were typically linen, a fabric made from flax grown and processed painstakingly in village fields. Linen was lighter and softer than wool but reserved for garments worn close to the skin, such as simple shifts for women and tunics for men. These undergarments absorbed the sweat and dirt of the day, making the outer wool layers less unbearable. However, both wool and linen were prized possessions, often handed down and patched repeatedly. Nothing was wasted. A tear in a cloak might be mended with a patch of cloth from an old sack, a scrap of fabric from worn-out clothing, or even leather taken from discarded shoes. This patchwork of repairs told stories of years spent in ceaseless labor, the fabric a physical map of endurance. Footwear and seasonal adaptations. Shoes were another mark of peasant life, often rudimentary and crafted from straw or coarse leather. Straw shoes, known as bast shoes or lapti, were woven from strips of bark or straw and were light but fragile, lasting only through a single season before they wore through. Leather shoes, when available, were simple and functional, thick-soled and sturdy, meant to protect against sharp stones, mud, and cold earth. The making of shoes was a vital village skill, often the work of a local cobbler, but many peasants fashioned their own with whatever materials they could find. Feet were rarely clean or comfortable, and the scent of wet leather mingled with the earthy smells of the fields in the village. Season dictated much about a peasant's wardrobe. In the long, cold winters, layers were added, heavier cloaks lined with coarse wool, hoods pulled low over heads, and sometimes makeshift mittens fashioned from scraps of cloth. Summer brought a slight relief in weight and warmth, but it was never a time of comfort. The sun's heat was harsh on wool, and linen undergarments became soaked with sweat under the unrelenting labor. The patchy, worn clothes rarely changed, and washing was a rare, difficult task performed in cold streams or communal washhouses, using rough soap made from animal fat and ashes. Gender, status, and economic value. Clothing also marked gender and status within the village. Men wore simple tunics reaching just above the knee, belted at the waist, with rough woolen hose or leggings. Their cloaks were heavier and often shorter for ease of movement in the fields. Women's garments were longer, simple woolen dresses with linen shifts underneath. Aprons, worn and patched, bore the stains of cooking, washing, and child-rearing. Head coverings were common for women, from simple linen wimples to woolen hoods, both to shield from weather and as markers of modesty and social expectation. Children's clothing mirrored that of adults but was even more worn and handed down. There was little room for growing wardrobes, garments passed from eldest to youngest, stitched and patched to stretch their lives. The dirt and wear on children's clothes reflected their constant play and work, helping in the fields, tending animals, or fetching water. Their clothes were a testimony to their slow, hard education in the ways of peasant life. The process of acquiring clothes was neither easy nor frequent. Peasants rarely bought new garments. Instead, they relied on homemade textiles, village weaving, and the labor of women and sometimes men in spinning, dyeing, and sewing. The spinning wheel, introduced gradually during the later medieval period, became a household fixture, turning flax into thread. Weaving was communal work, often done on large, slow wooden looms in the homes or village workshops. Dyeing relied on natural sources, lichen, bark, and plants, producing muted tones that faded quickly in the sun and rain. Each stage of textile production was time-consuming and labor-intensive, reflecting the value and scarcity of every yard of cloth. Peasant clothing was also an expression of economy and resourcefulness. Old garments were unraveled to reuse thread, scraps were repurposed, and garments were mended tirelessly. Every stitch was deliberate, every patch necessary. The practice of darning socks or sewing patches on cloaks was not simply functional but a quiet act of preservation, preserving dignity and survival in a harsh world. Clothing bore the marks of life, mud stains from the fields, burns from the hearth, and worn elbows from labor. It was a living document of the wearer's days, their hardships, and their resilience. Identity and enduring strength. Even the act of dressing was governed by necessity rather than choice. Peasants dressed in layers to shield themselves from the elements and to prepare for long hours outdoors. The cloak could be pulled tight against the wind, the hood drawn over the face in rain, and the rough fabric protected from the sharp thorns of brambles or the sting of cold. Clothes were tools as much as coverings, integral to the peasant's daily struggle against nature and circumstance. But clothing also marked social boundaries unmistakably. Nobles and clergy wore fine linens, silks, and velvets dyed in brilliant colors, embellished with embroidery and jewels. Their garments proclaimed power and wealth, while peasant clothing proclaimed endurance and humility. The mark of dirt and wear was not just from labor but a visual reminder of social place, a silent language understood by all. On festival days or special occasions, peasants might attempt to brighten their appearance, cleaning their best cloak, patching holes neatly, or adding a woven belt or simple adornment. But even then, their clothing was humble, modest, and deeply tied to the land and their status. The contrast between the fields of rough wool and the glittering robes of the manor was sharp and unavoidable. Ultimately, the clothing of medieval peasants tells a story beyond mere fabric and thread. It is a story of survival and identity, of labor's marks worn like a second skin, and of a life intimately connected to the rhythms of the seasons and the demands of social hierarchy. These cloaks of dirt, worn and patched, were more than clothing. They were the armor of endurance, the badge of a people bound to their land, their duty, and each other. Sickness without sanctuary, health and death among peasants. In the shadowed corners of medieval village life, sickness was a constant and often merciless companion. For peasants, health was a fragile and fleeting state, easily shattered by the harshness of their daily existence. The very soil they tilled and the water they drank could harbor dangers invisible to the eye. Sickness was not just an occasional visitor but an ever-present threat, looming like a specter that could descend swiftly and without mercy. In this world, medical knowledge was scarce, and the line between healing and harm was thin and uncertain. Cycles of vulnerability and common ailments. Peasants lived in a cycle of vulnerability, their bodies worn thin by relentless labor, poor nutrition, and exposure to the elements. Malnutrition was common, with diets deficient in essential vitamins and minerals. Rickets, a disease caused by vitamin D deficiency, was widespread among children, leaving bones soft and deformed, joints swollen and painful. These physical ailments were visible reminders of the deprivation woven into everyday life. Children often grew weak, their growth stunted before reaching adulthood, and many never survived past infancy. Fevers, coughs, and respiratory infections plagued peasants, especially during cold winters or damp seasons when cottages filled with smoke from hearth fires and little ventilation. Pneumonia, bronchitis, and tuberculosis, though poorly understood, were killers in these communities. A cough might start as a minor irritation but could quickly worsen into a fatal illness. The heavy, smoky air inside homes, combined with crowded living conditions and the constant chill of drafty walls, made recovery difficult if not impossible. Tooth decay and gum disease were also relentless afflictions. Without modern dentistry, medieval peasants endured persistent tooth pain and infections that could fester into abscesses, causing fever and sometimes death. Teeth were worn down by coarse, gritty bread, and cleaning was rudimentary, often limited to rinsing the mouth with water or chewing aromatic herbs thought to freshen breath or ease pain. The sight of missing or rotten teeth was common and unremarked upon, part of the visible toll of hard living. Childbirth perils and limited healing. Childbirth was one of the greatest risks faced by peasant women. Without the care of trained midwives or physicians, many births ended in tragedy. Complications such as obstructed labor, infections, or hemorrhaging were frequent and often fatal. The infant mortality rate was crushingly high, with many babies never surviving their first weeks. Mothers themselves sometimes did not survive the ordeal, leaving families bereft in a world where every adult was vital to survival. The village midwife or wise woman provided what care she could, guided by tradition, herbal remedies, and prayer, but her knowledge was limited and success uncertain. Healing itself was a patchwork of folk knowledge, superstition, and scarce medical practice. The village healer, often a wise woman or herbalist, held an essential but precarious role. She might gather plants like willow bark, known to relieve pain, or use poultices and salves made from herbs, roots, and animal fats. Her remedies, while sometimes effective, were inconsistent, and her role walked a fine line between revered healer and feared witch. Healing was as much spiritual as physical. Prayer and ritual often accompanied treatments, seeking divine intervention to mend body and soul. Church bells tolled for the sick and dying, their solemn peals a reminder of mortality that hung over the village like a shroud. Religion offered comfort and structure, a way to understand suffering and find hope beyond this life. Saints' relics, holy water, and prayers were turned to as means of healing, but the faith of peasants was frequently tested by the persistent presence of death. The priest's last rites marked the passage of the dying, a sacred moment steeped in fear and hope. Poor sanitation and enduring resilience. The causes of illness were poorly understood. Miasma theory, the belief that disease spread through bad air or foul smells, dominated medieval thought, making hygiene and sanitation only partially effective. Latrines and waste disposal were primitive, and contaminated water was a common vector for disease. Epidemics like the plague or smallpox could sweep through villages, devastating entire communities in terrifying waves. The inability to halt such diseases reinforced a pervasive sense of helplessness. Despite these dangers, peasant communities developed practical strategies for care and survival. Families cared for their own, nursing the sick with herbal teas, warm cloths, and constant vigil. The labor of the healthy was shared more heavily when someone fell ill, a communal effort to maintain the village's fragile balance. Illness was both an individual and a collective trial, shaping social bonds and rhythms. Death was never distant, and funerals were simple, somber affairs. The body was washed and wrapped in linen, then buried in the churchyard or a communal grave. The grief was raw but often restrained by the ever-present need to continue living amidst hardship. Stories of those who had died were woven into village memory, a quiet testimony to endurance and loss. In this harsh reality, health was a gift, a fragile treasure guarded by rituals, prayer, and cautious hope. Sickness revealed the limits of medieval medicine and the precariousness of peasant life, a life defined by toil, vulnerability, and the ever-present shadow of death. Learning through living, oral knowledge and folk wisdom. Long before books were bound in leather and stacked in monasteries, before schools lined city streets or names were etched into the history of written thought, there lived another form of knowledge. It was quiet, it was unwritten, and it flowed like a stream from mouth to mouth, from one generation's cracked hands to the next's calloused palms. This was the lifeblood of medieval peasant life, oral knowledge, born not of scholarship, but of necessity, repetition, and survival. For the medieval peasant, to live was to learn. The rhythms of the body and the land were the first teachers. There were no parchment scrolls, no alphabetized references, no inked illustrations of what to do when the sky grew gray or the crops drooped early. Instead, wisdom lived in voice and muscle memory, in lullabies sung over cradles, in the angle of a side stroke, in the careful gathering of herbs before the morning dew dried.
Sickness without sanctuary.
This was a knowledge without ink but not without precision. Practical cosmology and survival rules. The planting of crops, for instance, was governed by far more than simply putting seed to soil. Generations of observation had given rise to an intuitive calendar, deeply intertwined with celestial signs. A peasant knew not to sow certain seeds when the moon was waning, for it was believed they would not grow strong. Root vegetables fared better in dark moons, while grains favored the waxing light. These beliefs were not superstitions to the medieval mind, but accumulated experience, a practical cosmology grounded in the earth and sky. Salt meat before the frost comes, but not when the air is damp. That rule could mean the difference between a winter of nourishment or rot. Children didn't learn it from a teacher, they learned it from standing beside a parent as the carcass of a pig was hung, watching brine poured carefully into wooden barrels, hearing stories of winters when the meat spoiled too soon and bellies went hollow before spring. It was not a lesson in a textbook. It was the story of hunger, told softly, perhaps with a sigh. Pain, too, brought its own curriculum. A splintered bone, an infected wound, or the ache of childbirth called forth the local wise woman or healer. She might not read Latin or possess a physician's scroll, but she knew which leaf could draw poison, which bark dulled pain, and how to mix dried sage with honey for a persistent cough. The knowledge she held was passed down through generations of women like her, bound not by oath but by observation. She watched her mother gather nettles in spring, saw how elderberries were boiled into syrup before the frost, learned which fungi to avoid and which soothed fevers. Often, she learned by trial, by healing, and sometimes, tragically, by loss. Communal memory and environmental reading. And the memory of these trials was communal. A village did not forget the year the well turned bitter or when the rye sprouted fungus and made people speak nonsense and twitch in their sleep. These stories lived in warnings passed to children, in rituals of caution. Don't drink from the brook after the sheep have been washed. Don't let the goats near the field with the blackened stalks. These weren't written anywhere, yet they formed a living record, a folk archive built on lived experience. There was knowledge of time as well, not measured in hours, but in sun lengths and shadows. A peasant could read the day by how the light touched the barn door or how the roosters crowed in the stillness before dawn. They marked seasons by scents in the wind, the behavior of animals, the arrival of certain insects. When the bees stayed close to the hive, storm was certain. When the cows grew restless at dusk, wolves might be near. Every sound, every shift in the air, was part of an invisible textbook, always open, always teaching. Children were apprenticed not in schools but at their parents' sides. A daughter learned to spin by watching her mother's hands move in hypnotic circles over wool. A son learned to yoke oxen by walking barefoot behind the plow, guided by his father's muttered words and sharp corrections. This was not instruction in the formal sense. It was immersion. You learned because your family's survival depended on it. There was no graduation, no certificate, only the quiet passing of the torch, when one pair of tired hands gave way to another. Wisdom in stories and unwritten evolution. Even stories carried wisdom. Around the hearth in the evenings, old tales were told, not just to entertain, but to encode values, warnings, and memory. A story about a woman who got lost in the forest might actually be a guide to avoid certain paths. A tale of a lazy man who lost his crop served as a reminder to finish planting before the rains. And within the rhythms of those stories, metaphors and meanings ran deep. Listeners learned what was expected, what was sacred, what was dangerous, and what was possible. This oral culture, though fragile, was dynamic. It adapted, shifted, and grew with each generation. When a new sickness swept through, remedies were tested. Some worked and were remembered. Others failed and were buried with the dead. This slow, collective process was how knowledge evolved. Not in ivory towers, but in fields and kitchens and by firelight. Women, often overlooked in written history, were central keepers of this folk wisdom. From the birthing stool to the cooking hearth, they held centuries of experience in their heads and hands. Midwives remembered births gone wrong and what had soothed the bleeding. Cooks knew which plants turned bitter if picked too late in the season. Spinners, weavers, brewers, all carried craft knowledge deeper than they could articulate. They passed it on not with lectures, but through repetition, through the body's knowledge, through story. There was, too, a sacred humility in this way of learning. Peasants understood that nature was always the master and they the student. The weather, the soil, the livestock, all had moods and rhythms that had to be respected. Arrogance could lead to failure. The ones who prospered were those who listened closely, to the wind, to the bees, to the breath of the land. It is easy, from the vantage point of the modern age, to see medieval peasant life as ignorant. But ignorance implies a lack of wisdom, and that would be a mistake. What these people lacked in formal education, they made up for in attentiveness, in memory, and in oral resilience. They knew how to survive, and survival was no small feat. In the end, their knowledge did not need ink to endure. It lived in the soil, in the folds of garments, in the hands that coaxed life from stubborn earth. It lived in whispers, in lullabies, in warnings murmured as twilight fell. And even now, if you stand quietly on an old field once worked by hands long gone, you might hear it, the faint echo of lessons passed from one human heart to another, across centuries of forgotten breath. Law of the land, justice and punishment in the village. In the quiet thrum of medieval village life, justice was not a concept sealed in marble halls or shielded behind high parchment law. It was visible, it was local, and for the peasant, it often arrived not in the form of rights, but of duties and punishments. The rule of law, such as it existed in the feudal countryside, was as rough-hewn as the timbers of the manor house. It lived and breathed among the people, embedded in habits, customs, and deeply symbolic acts. Justice was not blind. It had eyes, and they belonged to your neighbors. The manorial court, local justice. At the center of this rural legal world stood the manorial court, presided over by the lord of the manor, or, more commonly, his appointed steward. These courts were not the arena of high treason or noble disputes, but of the slow grind of everyday friction. A borrowed plow returned broken, a fence post moved to claim another strip of land, a pig rooting in someone else's garden. Here, law was lived. It regulated the web of peasant life, bound up with custom and obligation rather than abstract legislation. To live on a manor meant to owe labor, rent, or both to the lord. The manorial court was the mechanism to ensure these obligations were met. Each tenant was registered, and his duties recorded in the court roll, a precious document that served as both ledger and memory. If a man failed to show up for plowing duty or withheld the lord's portion of grain, it was here that his name would be called. Fines were levied more often than force. But justice, like the seasons, was relentless. Court sessions were often held outdoors, under trees or beside the manor barn, and attendance was mandatory. Not just for the accused, but for the entire community. Justice was a public matter. It was not hidden behind doors. The villagers watched, listened, and sometimes judged themselves. Juries were made of fellow villagers, drawn from the very world they were asked to rule upon. They knew who had trespassed, who had gossiped, who had stolen the bundle of firewood. Justice was communal, and so was its memory. Custom, punishment, and public humiliation. For the medieval peasant, guilt or innocence was not merely a question of facts. It was a matter of standing within the web of custom. Law was oral and local before it was written in uniform. If a custom had been practiced for decades, such as grazing one's sheep on a common field, it had weight. If a man tried to change that rhythm, to claim for himself what had long been shared, he risked more than a fine. He risked the rupture of a fragile balance. Punishment, when it came, was not meant to disappear into silence. It was designed to be seen. For minor offenses, petty theft, gossip, drunkenness, there were stocks and pillories. These wooden devices, placed in the village center, forced the guilty to sit or stand immobilized, their arms and legs awkwardly secured. There, exposed to the elements and the mocking stares of neighbors, a man or woman would serve their sentence. Laughter, insults, even thrown scraps or dung were not uncommon. The goal was humiliation, a public reminder that order must be preserved. There was no privacy in penance. More serious crimes, poaching the Lord's game, striking an officer of the court, repeated thievery, might bring fines beyond one's means. In rare cases, offenders could be expelled from the village, a form of social death. Exile meant not only losing your home, but your place in the tightly bound fabric of survival. Without a village, without ties, a peasant became a vagabond, and vagabonds had no protection. Yet brutal as these punishments may seem, they were not arbitrary. In their own way, they were predictable and symbolic, guided by tradition more than cruelty. There were limits to a lord's power, boundaries not always written but deeply felt. A lord who punished too harshly risked revolt or resistance. Justice, to be accepted, had to mirror the world it governed. Oaths, wider courts, and gendered justice. Disputes between neighbors were often resolved with oaths, solemn swearing before God and community. A man might clear his name by bringing forward a number of oath helpers, people willing to swear to his honesty. This practice, known as compurgation, was less about evidence than about reputation. If no one was willing to stand beside you, your guilt was assumed. Honor was currency. When conflicts escalated beyond the manor, when blood was spilled, or land was contested between manors, justice rose to another level. These cases might be sent to the 100 Court or Shire Court, broader assemblies that covered more territory and followed the king's law. But such elevation was rare for peasants. Their lives, their conflicts, were mostly settled within earshot of their fields and hearths. Women, too, stood before these courts. They were fined for brewing bad ale, for gossiping too loudly, or for scolding their husbands in public. The scold's bridle, a cruel iron mask used in later centuries, symbolizes the darker edge of communal justice, especially when gendered norms were breached. Women's roles were tightly defined, and deviations were punished with humiliating zeal. Children were not exempt. If old enough to labor, they were old enough to be judged. A boy who trampled another's field or stole eggs from a henhouse might be made to confess in public, made an example for others. Justice began early, as did the knowledge of one's place in the social order. Evolution of law and enduring purpose. There were no lawyers here, no appeals, no lofty speeches. The law was not a shield, it was a mirror, reflecting the expectations of those who lived together in thin-walled cottages and shared plows. And within that mirror, fairness was not always the goal. Harmony was. The system was designed not to ensure individual rights, but to preserve collective stability. Even so, justice was not static. Over centuries, the growing reach of the crown, the influence of the church, and the emergence of written law began to reshape village justice. Clergy increasingly played roles in court, especially when issues of morality or church tithe arose. Literacy, rare as it was among peasants, began to filter into the legal world. Customs were recorded, codified, and occasionally challenged. Still, oral testimony and local memory remained the foundation of rural justice. In time, the stocks would rot. The pillories would vanish. The manorial court would be replaced by magistrates and bureaucrats. But for the long medieval centuries, the peasant lived in a world where justice had a face, a name, and stood in the same muddy streets. It was close enough to see, close enough to fear, and yet, in its own deeply imperfect way, it bound the village together. It reminded every man, woman, and child that their actions echoed across fields and generations. That to break the law was not only to offend a distant lord, but to disturb the fragile equilibrium of communal life. Justice was not blind, it looked you in the eyes. The unseen pillars, women and their invisible labor. They woke before the light. Often while the mist still curled low over the meadows and smoke drifted lazily from the previous night's embers, the women of the medieval village were already stirring. Not by bell or by rooster's crow, but by rhythm, a rhythm not of their own choosing, but one etched into the soul like grooves in worn wood. Theirs was a life of unseen, continuous labor, a quiet motion that kept entire households from unraveling, yet was rarely acknowledged, never praised, and often dismissed as mere duty. Relentless domestic tasks. A peasant woman's hands were never idle. Rough with calluses and cracked from cold water and coarse wool, they moved between tasks like breath moves through lungs, vital, unnoticed, continuous. First came the tending of the fire, coaxing warmth from ashes with a practiced patience. Then came bread. The daily loaf was not a simple act but a sacred chain of preparation, grinding last season's grain with heavy, circular strokes against a quern stone, mixing coarse flour with water and salt, shaping it by hand, and baking it in a communal oven, if space and time allowed. It was more than nourishment, it was the promise of survival. Children clung to her skirts, needing warmth and wiping noses on sleeves already stained with animal dung, soil, and flour. A baby, wrapped tightly against the chill, nursed between stirring pottage and feeding hens. She was nurse, cook, farmer, and seamstress before the first sunbeam pierced the cottage window. And yet, her labor did not belong to her. It belonged to her household, to her husband, to her lord. Labor in fields and home. In the fields, she followed the furrow, side by side with the men. Though law and culture defined the plow as a man's domain, in practice, women's labor filled the gaps. They weeded, gleaned, sowed, and harvested. In times of scarcity, and scarcity was frequent, they yoked themselves to carts when oxen failed, carrying hay or manure with bent backs and steady pace. They knew the seasons as well as any priest knew scripture, when to plant onions, how to store beans through frost, and which herbs soothed the belly in lean months. There was no division between public and private for these women. The world they governed was both hearth and field, cradle and coffin. Their lives were cyclical, like the moon phases they tracked with a glance and the bleeding they endured with quiet endurance. Men were praised for strength and protection, women were expected to endure. And endure they did, through childbirth without midwives, through endless spinning of wool, through long winter nights mending tears by candlelight, their faces lit by orange flickers, their silence filled only by the ticking of hand-wound spindles. Childbirth, knowledge, and marriage. Childbirth alone was a battle, fought not with steel but with silent prayers and blood. It was the most dangerous work a woman could do, and it was expected of her. Some survived. Many did not, and those who did bore not just children, but the weight of care for each, feeding them, clothing them, teaching them how to survive in a world that gave them little. Their knowledge was vast, though rarely written. It lived in fingertips and gestures, in songs sung softly at dusk and tales told while shelling peas. They knew how to make ale from grain and how to keep it from spoiling. They dyed cloth with lichen and boiled herbs for fever. They knew which root was safe to chew during labor, and which one might end it prematurely. Their wisdom was not praised in manuscripts or honored in church halls, but it lingered in the bodies they healed and the food they cooked. Marriage, too, was a contract shaped more by labor than love. A woman's role was defined by what she could contribute, a dowry if lucky, a strong back if not. She became wife and worker in a single breath, sometimes at 12, sometimes younger. Her rights were fewer than her husband's. She could not own land, and her word carried less weight in disputes. Yet behind every plowman stood the woman who patched his cloak, baked his bread, and buried his stillborns with her own hands. Widowhood and communal support. Widowhood offered one of the few glimpses of independence. Without a husband, a woman might control a bit of land, perhaps even run a household in her own name. But this independence was hard-won and often short-lived. Remarriage was common, not for love, but for survival. A man needed a woman to maintain his home, just as she needed a home to keep her children alive. Children were part of the labor force too. Girls learned by imitation, spinning thread beside their mothers, carrying firewood, feeding geese. By the time they were 10, they worked nearly as hard as grown women. Girlhood, like rest, was brief and largely invisible. Their games were brief pockets of joy, plucking petals from flowers or hopping over stones, but these were always shadowed by the work waiting at home. Women also formed the invisible web of community. They shared childcare, midwifery, and mourning. When a child died, as many did, women gathered not just to grieve but to ensure the mother didn't fall apart entirely. They laid out the body, wept together, and prepared the burial. In joy and in pain, the village women stood as one, a silent order of mutual endurance. Spiritual life and enduring legacy. Their spiritual lives, too, were shaped by burden. They listened to sermons in Latin they didn't understand, knelt before icons they couldn't interpret, and still clung to faith with the tenacity of the poor. For them, heaven was not abstract, it was the only retirement they could hope for. Saints like Anne and Mary held particular meaning, not just for their holiness, but for their understanding of work, pain, and perseverance. And still, they sang. Even while scrubbing laundry by the river or digging up turnips, their voices drifted across the fields. Songs of courtship, of sorrow, of saints and seasons. The songs were theirs, passed from mother to daughter, never written, never performed for lords or kings. These melodies were woven into the landscape like threads in homespun cloth, modest, strong, and utterly essential. As winter returned each year, it was often the women who kept the warmth alive. They preserved the last carrots, spun the wool into cloaks, and wrapped their children in patchwork blankets. Their names may not be carved in stone, but their fingers stitched the very seams of medieval life. They were not invisible because they did nothing. They were invisible because their labor, relentless, life-giving, complex, was expected. Expected, and therefore unpraised. But they were the unseen pillars that held the peasant world upright. And if you listened, truly listened, to the rhythm of that village, you would hear their footsteps, always moving, from hearth to field, from cradle to grave, and back again. The cycle of years, peasant childhood to old age. The cycle of life in a medieval village was as dependable and relentless as the turning of the seasons. A peasant's time on earth unfolded within boundaries shaped not only by class and geography but by the quiet tyranny of necessity. Childhood came swiftly, adulthood came early, and old age, if it came at all, was often little more than a whisper before the grave. Yet within this narrow arc of years, a full human life was lived, marked by hardship, routine, and moments of quiet grace. Precarious infancy and early labor. A baby was born into a cold world, not just physically, but socially. There was joy in a new life, of course, but always shadowed by risk. Infant mortality was staggering. Disease, malnourishment, and poor hygiene made survival uncertain. Many children died unnamed, buried without ceremony in small, shallow plots just beyond the churchyard. Those who lived were quickly brought into the fold of the living, and the church, baptized within days, often by a midwife if a priest could not come quickly enough. It wasn't simply a ritual, it was an urgent spiritual safeguard. An unbaptized infant who died, it was believed, might not find rest in heaven. Swaddled in wool wrappings and laid beside the hearth, a baby's early months were shaped by the rhythms of the mother's work. There were no nurseries, no soft cradles. Babies were fed when their mothers could stop long enough to sit, soothed by the same hands kneading dough and scrubbing pots. Fathers were generally distant from early childcare, not out of indifference, but because they, too, were bound by labor. Work consumed everyone. By the time a child could walk, they were expected to help. By 4 or 5, they fetched water and watched younger siblings. By 7, they joined in seasonal work, picking stones from fields, scaring birds from sown crops, collecting firewood. Childhood was not an age of innocence, but a training ground for toil. Toys were rare, fashioned from scrap wood or straw. A carved whistle, a cloth doll, a hoop of bent twigs. Play was brief and squeezed between tasks. But it existed. Children laughed, chased chickens, and splashed in streams. Even here, in a world burdened by labor, joy found a way to root itself. Formal education was nearly non-existent for most peasant children. A lucky few might learn rudimentary prayers or psalms, usually in Latin, without understanding their meaning. Most knowledge came orally, passed down through stories, songs, and observation. A child learned to judge weather by the wind, to read the health of a pig by its grunt, and to sense when the soil was ready for planting. Their minds grew not with letters but with labor, adolescence, marriage, and relentless cycles. By 12, a child was considered on the threshold of adulthood. Girls began to spin wool and help with childbirth. Boys followed their fathers into the fields, swinging real tools instead of wooden imitations. Puberty was not marked with celebration but with increased expectations. With every season, they edged closer to the life their parents lived, one of quiet endurance. Marriage, for most, came young. Girls married by 15, sometimes earlier. Boys married later, often needing more years to prove their worth or inherit a plot of land. Marriage was rarely about love. It was an arrangement, often brokered by families or lords, focused on land, survival, and shared labor. A wife was chosen not for beauty, but for strength and her ability to keep a home alive through lean seasons. Once married, life became an echo of the past generation. A peasant's adult years were filled with unending cycles, planting and harvest, births and burials, feasts and fasts. Each year looked much like the last, and the next. The rhythm of life was the rhythm of the land. With little travel or change, identity fused with the immediate world, the village well, the church bell, the hedgerow path trod daily from cottage to field. Old age, death, and enduring legacy. Yet there were moments of light. The birth of a healthy child. A good harvest. A midsummer dance. Laughter at the communal oven. Life was not without joy. It simply didn't depend on ease or luxury. Relationships were forged not in idle conversation, but in shared hardship. A neighbor who lent a cow during famine, a midwife who arrived in the snow, a husband who mended boots by candlelight. These small acts created bonds as strong as iron. But time wore down the body. Years of bending, lifting, and exposure to the elements took their toll. Most peasants bore the posture of labor, backs hunched, joints swollen, teeth lost. Sickness came often, and medicine, when it existed, offered little more than hope wrapped in herbs and prayers. Women aged quickly from childbirth and ceaseless labor. Men carried old injuries, untreated and chronic. Those who reached old age were few. A peasant over 50 was seen as ancient, a keeper of long memory. If their body allowed, they continued to work, perhaps no longer in the fields, but at the spinning wheel, the henhouse, or instructing the younger generation. Old age offered no retirement, only a slow yielding to weakness. Yet it also brought a kind of reverence. The old were listened to, not always obeyed, but respected for having survived. Death was rarely a surprise. It came with fever, with childbirth, with bad winters. It came in the night or in the field. It came to the old and the very young most often, but no one was safe. When it came, it was met not with denial, but with ritual. The church provided structure, last rites if the priest arrived in time, candles lit for the soul, burial in consecrated ground if fortune allowed. Grief was sharp but brief, not from lack of feeling, but from necessity. The living had to keep living. And so, from cradle to grave, a peasant's life unfolded in quiet circles, work, rest, feast, and prayer. It was not a life of ease, but neither was it empty. Within the constraints of poverty and hierarchy, peasants built lives with meaning, in their families, their fields, their faith, and each other. Their stories were rarely written. They left no diaries, no portraits, no carved tombs. But in the grooves of the land they tilled, in the hearths they warmed, and the generations they raised, their legacy remains, not grand, but enduring. Not glorious, but real. Counting pennies, counting chickens, the peasant economy. To understand the world of the medieval peasant, one must begin not with coins, but with absence. The peasant economy was not built on currency but on necessity, on what could be grown, gathered, bartered, or begged. In this realm of hard labor and harder winters, survival was the ledger, and wealth was measured not in gold, but in chickens, bundles of hay, and loaves of coarse bread. Barter and labor as currency. For the vast majority of peasants, coinage was a rarity. A silver penny, if it ever passed through a peasant's hands, would be quickly spent or tithed, often never to return. Most daily transactions happened in barter. A dozen eggs for a length of spun wool, a sack of oats for the repair of a plowshare. Shoemakers might be paid in grain. A potter might leave with a cured ham. Currency was not entirely absent, but it flowed around peasants more than through them, resting in the hands of reeves, bailiffs, priests, and merchants who moved more freely through the market world. Still, every peasant family needed to navigate a system of obligations that was deeply economic in nature, though few would have called it such. Every acre they tilled belonged not to them but to their lord. That land came with duties, labor dues, rents, and tithes, owed regardless of a family's fortune or failure in a given year. If the harvest was poor, the rent still came due. If the cow died or the pig sickened, the grain still had to be handed over. There was no pause for hardship. Most peasants paid their rents in kind, sheaves of wheat, a dozen eggs, or a portion of the barley they raised. Labor was also currency. A man might be summoned to plow the domain fields, the lord's own reserved land, or to carry firewood to the manor house, or to repair a wall around the grain barn. These days were called boom work or week work and were not optional. The peasant's body itself was part of the currency of survival, the burden of tithes and limited markets. And then there was the church. The tithe was a heavy burden, a full tenth of all that the land produced. This was meant to support the local clergy, maintain the church building, and offer alms to the poor. But to the peasant, it often felt like one more mouth to feed from a pot already half empty. Tithes were collected in grain, lambs, honey, even bundles of flax. A priest might ride from farm to farm with a cart, inspecting storehouses and barns, ensuring that God's share had not been forgotten. Markets were rare, and for many peasants, attending one was a long walk and a major event. These markets offered a glimpse of a broader world: spices from distant lands, bolts of dyed cloth, iron tools forged in nearby towns. Here, the peasant might sell a surplus chicken or a few wheels of cheese, hoping to return with a needed item or a scrap of coin. But surplus was rare. Most peasants lived with the knowledge that one bad season could wipe away what little they had stored. To endure this constant precarity, peasants developed intricate webs of mutual aid and informal economy. A neighbor who shared seed in spring would expect help at harvest. A loan of oxen for plowing might be repaid in firewood or wool. These arrangements were rarely written, but they were remembered, deeply embedded in the memory of the village. To violate such a trust was to risk not only shame, but practical ruin. Supplementary income and external pressures. Some peasants supplemented their meager income with craft. A woman might spin wool in the long winter nights, trading yarn for salt or soap. A man might whittle simple tools, or gather herbs to sell to the local wise woman or healer. These were not luxuries, they were acts of survival, small efforts to stretch the margins of a narrow life. Children were part of this economy too. They collected dung for fuel, gathered mushrooms and nuts, and helped tend animals. From the age of reason, they understood the value of every egg, every stick of firewood. There was no allowance, no pocket money. Their reward was warmth, food, and the continued shelter of a household struggling to stay upright. Taxes came from above, layered atop the other burdens. A lord might impose a hearth tax, charging for every fire that smoked beneath a peasant's thatch. The king, in turn, might call for aid, funds for war or ransom, demanded not just from nobles but from the villages as well. Though these taxes were collected by the lord or his reeve, they filtered ever downward, and it was the peasant who paid, whether with coin scraped together or livestock taken in kind. Even the weather held economic weight. A summer drought meant a thin harvest and early hunger. A cold spring delayed planting, causing ripple effects through the year. Famine was not merely a fear, it was a memory, sometimes recent. Villagers remembered years when people dug roots from the frozen earth, or when the weak were left to die quietly because there was no bread to share. Resilience and enduring spirit. When times were good, they were never easy. A good harvest did not mean leisure, it meant longer hours in the fields, the need to store, dry, thresh, and guard the bounty. A full granary was a temptation to thieves, and peasants could not afford locks. Joy was measured not in wealth but in moments, when a pig grew fat enough to butcher, when cider flowed after a strong apple year, when the shoes held through another winter. Debt was another quiet specter. A peasant might borrow seed or livestock and fall into a slow, grinding repayment that lasted years. If the debt was to the Lord, there was little mercy. If it was to a neighbor, shame and memory ensured it would not be forgotten. Some debts were passed down, father to son, another weight carried into the next generation. And still, peasants found ways to carve meaning from the struggle. The economy of the medieval peasant was not merely a tale of scarcity, but of resilience. Every hen kept alive through frost, every loaf baked from gleaned grain, every woven cloth from homespun thread was a quiet triumph. In a world where the rules were made elsewhere and the rewards were unevenly shared, the simple act of surviving another year was its own kind of defiance. So they counted their pennies, when they had them, and their chickens, when they could spare one. They counted time not by banknotes but by sunrises, feast days, and the slow curve of the moon. They stitched together an economy not of balance sheets, but of favors, memories, sweat, and hope. And in this way, against the odds and beyond the eyes of the powerful, they endured. Faces in the shadows, peasants and the nobility. They were always there, those figures atop the hill. Cloaked in velvet, riding horses that glimmered like sun-polished brass, the nobles of the medieval world passed through the fields of peasants like shadows slipping through fog. Their presence was not constant, but it was immense, felt in the tax rolls, in the court summons, in the whispered warnings not to stray too close when the Lord's men were near. A peasant might live his entire life without ever speaking directly to a noble, and yet, from cradle to grave, he lived beneath them, legally, economically, spiritually. The nobility were not simply people, they were a structure, an altitude, a ceiling too high to touch. The feudal order did not merely organize society, it etched distance into its very design. Land belonged to the lords, and through it, so did the people. A peasant worked the earth but did not own it. The soil he tilled fed his children and the manor alike. He might owe a portion of his harvest to the Lord, a separate tithe to the church, and perhaps coin to a reeve. And though this system was called mutual, it was rarely equal. The nobility offered protection, but that word meant many things. Sometimes it meant safety from raiders or rival armies. More often, it meant protection from the very system they controlled. Encounters and resentment. Encounters between peasants and the nobility were rarely neutral. There was always tension, though it might remain buried beneath a bowed head or lowered eyes. A peasant might be summoned to the manor court to pay a fine for letting his pigs wander. He might be seen by the bailiff when requesting permission to marry outside the village. The noble's steward might visit during the harvest to ensure the quotas were met. In each case, the relationship was one of power and deference. The noble rarely needed to raise his voice, his position was loud enough. The manor itself was the axis around which a peasant's world turned. From its stone steps issued orders, obligations, and expectations. Its windows glimmered with a wealth peasants could barely fathom. Inside, tapestries, cutlery, and glass were objects from a world of unimaginable comfort. And yet, these luxuries were often paid for with the backs of those in the fields, laboring, aging, dying. Thatched roofs sagged and clay floors cracked in the peasant's hut while the lord's walls rose higher, adorned with the symbols of lineage and conquest. Still, the manor was more than a building. It was a symbol of permanence, of the hierarchy carved into the countryside. There were times when this imbalance stirred resentment. A harsh winter, an unjust tax, a brutal reeve. These could provoke murmurs in the alehouse, sullen glares during feasts, or even, on rare occasions, revolt. But open rebellion was the exception. More common was the quiet endurance of injustice. The small acts of defiance, a hidden sheaf of grain, a lie about a sow's litter, a refusal to show full deference. These were the tools of a people who knew the price of direct confrontation. The nobility, with their men-at-arms and legal might, could crush dissent like a boot on moss. Paternalism engendered divides. But not all lords were tyrants. Some practiced a form of paternalism, seeing their serfs as a kind of extended household. They might mediate disputes fairly, ensure the village mill worked well, or provide alms in lean years. A noblewoman might send surplus fabric to peasant families in the wake of childbirth. These gestures, however sincere, never altered the imbalance, they only softened its sharper edges. A benevolent lord could still demand unpaid labor, still withhold marriage permissions, still uproot families by decree. Kindness was no substitute for freedom. Children were taught early to recognize nobility. They learned the proper way to bow, the phrases of submission, the way to make themselves invisible in the presence of the highborn. To mistake the boundary between peasant and noble was to risk humiliation, or worse. Yet children also noticed what adults did not say. They watched how their parents stiffened when the steward approached, how they quieted when the manner was mentioned. Reverence mingled with fear. It soaked into the air like smoke from a hearth that never went out. For women, the divide was doubly rigid. A noblewoman might ride through the village flanked by guards, her silks rippling in the breeze. A peasant girl her age, barefoot and flushed from heat, might glance up just long enough to wonder what it would be like to wear linen that wasn't scratchy or patched. Yet their lives were not simply divided by wealth, but by fate. A noblewoman might be sent to a nunnery or married for alliance. A peasant woman might die before 30 from childbirth or toil. Both lived within constraints, but the noble's cage was gilded, and far more distant from hunger. Glimpses, taxes, and enduring life. Peasants sometimes served in noble households, especially younger sons or daughters of struggling families. These positions, though exploitative, gave them a glimpse into the noble life, the customs, the flavors of exotic food, the scent of perfumed soap. But those glimpses faded quickly upon return to the village, like dreams after waking. What they saw could not be recreated in the mud and wattle homes from which they came. Memory became a burden, an image of possibility that could never be lived. Taxes were the most regular reminder of the noble's presence. Even in absence, the lord's demand was ever present. It arrived in measured sacks of wheat, in coin, in a goat given as rent. When the harvest failed, the peasant might plead for mercy. Occasionally, the noble relented. Often, he did not. Debts were inherited like eye color or soil rights, passing from father to son. Poverty, once affixed, was generational. The noble could move, negotiate, marry for gain. The peasant remained tethered to the earth, rooted, unmoving. There were also moments of uneasy mingling. During feast days or processions, the lord and his family might appear publicly in the village. Banners flew, food was distributed, and music played. For a brief window, the social walls thinned, but never crumbled. The noble was still robed in wealth, the peasant still barefoot. Toasts were made to the health of the lord, blessings given for his kindness. But behind the smiles, a quiet knowledge hung in the air. By tomorrow, the bread would be gone, and the mill dues would still be owed. Religion reinforced the divide. Priests often preached obedience, humility, and the divine order of things. The noble was placed above not just by law, but by God's will, or so it was taught. The peasant learned that rebellion was a sin, and suffering a path to heaven. These teachings soothed some and shackled others. Faith could provide comfort, but it also provided excuses for inequity. The cathedral might have been built by peasants, but it belonged to the elite. They sat at the front. The poor stood in the back or outside the door. Survival and resilience. And yet, even under the weight of this order, the peasant survived. He found joy in his children, warmth in his hearth, laughter in shared labor. He endured not because he accepted his place, but because he had no choice. Some dreamed of freedom, others of small comforts, a better harvest, a milder winter. A few fled the manor and tried their luck in the growing towns, where freedom might be bought with coin. Most did not. Most stayed. Most were buried in the same village where they were born. In the end, the noble's shadow never quite left the peasant. Even after death, his name might be recorded in manor rolls, his debts listed, his heirs bound to the same land. But he left behind more than toil. He left behind stories, seeds, and songs. He left behind a legacy of quiet resilience. And somewhere on the hill, behind the manor walls, the noble lived on, oblivious to the man who had fed his fields and named his seasons. Smoldering sparks, peasant revolts and secret resistance. Let the torches flicker low. Let the fog settle thick in the hedgerows. We step now into one of the rare moments when the soft silence of subservience gave way to the sharp whisper of defiance. Peasants, long bound to furrows and oaths, found brief and perilous moments to say, no. And though history does not always echo with their names, their footsteps still stir the dust of old roads. This is not a tale of triumph. It is the story of anger smoldering just beneath the dirt. The roots of discontent. Life for a medieval peasant was shaped by obedience. To the land, to the church, to the Lord. But obedience, even when taught from the cradle, is not the same as agreement. Within every backbreaking labor, every unjust tithe, every hungry season, a slow burning awareness kindled. Things might be otherwise. Most peasants did not dare say such thoughts aloud. Yet across years and across villages, beneath the clatter of wooden carts and the tolling of manorial bells, something stirred. The English countryside in the 14th century offers one of the clearest windows into this rare unrest. The plague had torn through the land not once but in waves. Families vanished overnight. Fields lay fallow for lack of hands to till them. Entire hamlets were swallowed back into the earth. With so many dead, the value of surviving laborers rose, but the lords, fearing loss of control, tried to freeze wages and restrict movement. In 1351, the Statute of Laborers was passed, demanding that no man or woman accept more pay than they had earned before the plague. It was a desperate effort to preserve a crumbling order. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381. And yet, order resisted cannot remain order for long. In 1381, after years of heavy poll taxes and legal suppression, the people moved. The Peasants' Revolt, as it would later be named, began not with a bang, but with the gathering of voices, the passing of messages, the clenching of calloused fists. In Kent and Essex, groups of peasants began to march. They had no uniforms, no trained ranks. Their armor was borrowed. Their weapons, farming tools. But they had conviction, and that, for a few brief weeks, was enough. This was no disorganized riot. The rebels, though commoners, knew precisely what they opposed. Taxation, serfdom, unjust law. Many carried with them the words of John Ball, a radical priest long imprisoned for speaking dangerous truths. When Adam delved and Eve span, he had preached, who was then the gentleman? His words were a spark in dry straw. Led by Wat Tyler, the movement swelled, reaching London with astonishing speed. The rebels entered the city and found that, for a moment, the mighty had no defense. The Tower of London was breached. Royal advisors were killed. The boy king, Richard II, only 14 years old, met with the peasants, promising reform. But promises are wind. Soon after, Tyler was struck down in a skirmish. The rebellion lost its center. What followed was a swift, merciless suppression. Still, something had cracked. Though many leaders were executed and reforms reversed, the idea of change had taken root. No longer could the ruling class assume blind obedience. Even in failure, the revolt haunted the halls of power. European uprisings and subtle resistance. But England was not alone in its unrest. Across Europe, similar sparks flickered. In France, the Jacquerie uprising of 1358 saw desperate peasants rise against the nobility in a savage, chaotic frenzy. The French countryside, ravaged by the Hundred Years' War, gave birth to fury. And in the German territories, uprisings, large and small, occurred sporadically throughout the late Middle Ages. Often, these were crushed quickly. But each one left behind scorched memories, whispered legends, and the scent of fear. Resistance was not always so loud. Most defiance was subtle, woven into the daily rhythm. A gleaned handful of grain when none was looking. A complaint murmured too close to the Lord's steward. A refusal to show up for corvée labor on a holy day. These small acts did not change the world, but they reminded the oppressed of their own minds. The simple decision to rest 1 hour longer, to delay a tithe, to forget an order, each act contained a seed of selfhood. In truth, the medieval world was threaded with quiet rebellion. Women brewed ale and sold it against local rules. Men gathered after curfew in hidden corners to speak of rumors and injustices. Some peasants left the manors entirely, fleeing to towns, changing their names, hoping anonymity would buy freedom. Laws tried to catch them, manorial lords chased them, but some slipped away. The existence of these laws itself proves their necessity. Resistance was real. The tragic humanity of revolt. What makes peasant revolt so human is its tragedy. Rarely did it lead to better lives for the participants. Their names, if recorded at all, appear in court rolls and execution lists. Yet the fact that they rose, that they risked all despite having nothing, speaks to something profound. Hope, even battered and dim, still lived in fields soaked with toil. For those left behind after each revolt's failure, silence returned like snowfall. Fields were plowed again, sheep were sheared, children were born, but the silence was never quite the same. Somewhere in the memory of every village was the knowledge that, once, ordinary people had said no. That knowledge mattered. Imagine the smoke curling from a peasant's hearth the day after the revolt was crushed. Imagine the children returning to scattered toys. The chickens still pecking, the sky unchanged. The grief was quiet, but it etched itself into bone. A father did not come home. A sister's name was no longer spoken aloud. And still, the sowing began again. Yet even amid sorrow, a flicker remained. Because the idea that peasants were not merely part of the land, but people, had been spoken. It would take centuries for that truth to find law, to find recognition. But it began here, with rebellion not as heroism, but as dignity. Today, when we walk the cobbled lanes of old English villages, or stand by a crumbled hedge where once a field stretched wide, we do not hear the shouts. We hear only birdsong and breeze. But under that soil, the memory of refusal remains. The land remembers, and so do we. Thunder on the horizon, disasters, famine, and the Black Death. The life of a medieval peasant was a fragile thread stretched taut over the unpredictable loom of nature and circumstance. Among the most fearsome forces that shaped their existence were disasters that crept with quiet menace, disasters that could turn fertile fields to barren wastelands, transform bustling villages into ghostly silence, and claim lives in terrifying numbers. These calamities were not swift or dramatic in the way of battle, but slow, insidious storms that battered the spirit and body alike, leaving deep scars on the land and its people. Famine, the slow poison. The first and most relentless of these was famine. Unlike the fleeting harshness of a cold winter or a brief drought, famine arrived as a drawn-out shadow, a slow poison that sapped the strength of the earth and the souls who depended on it. The medieval agricultural cycle was precariously balanced on the mercy of the seasons, the timing of rains, and the fertility of the soil, none of which could ever be truly controlled. When the rains failed or fell in torrents, when a harsh frost came too early or a scorching sun lingered too long, the consequences rippled through the fields and villages alike. When famine took hold, the fields that had once promised sustenance offered nothing but a cruel reminder of what was lost. Crops rotted in the soil, seeds washed away by floods or scorched by drought, and the fragile shoots that did break ground were often feeble and sparse. For peasants, who lived hand to mouth, the failure of the harvest meant a tightening noose around their throats. Their diet, already simple and repetitive, grew even more meager. Where once there might have been coarse rye bread and thick pottage made of root vegetables and pulses, now hunger gnawed ceaselessly. They boiled tree bark and ground acorns to supplement their food, eating what animals might scavenge or what wild plants they could forage. The physical toll was devastating. Malnutrition rendered bodies weak and vulnerable, and diseases that would normally be minor became lethal. Fevers ran rampant through the weakened populace. Scurvy and rickets took hold as vitamin deficiencies spread. Child mortality soared, as the youngest and frailest were the first to fall. Mothers watched helplessly as their infants wasted away, their grief compounding the weight of despair. The older peasants, who had survived countless seasons, found themselves drained and broken by the unrelenting scarcity. The Black Death, a swift and mysterious killer. But famine was only one face of the disaster that stalked the medieval countryside. When the earth finally seemed to heal and the skies cleared, another horror came. An invisible enemy that swept through villages with unstoppable ferocity. The plague, often called the Black Death, was a specter that descended from the shadows, changing everything it touched. Unlike famine, which starved the body slowly, the plague struck with brutal speed, turning vibrant communities into scenes of death and abandonment within weeks. The arrival of the plague was terrifyingly mysterious to the peasants. They knew only that it came with sudden sickness, fever, chills, weakness, followed by the appearance of swollen, dark lumps called buboes. These painful swellings marked the doomed, a cruel badge of impending death. Some suffered from a more violent form, where the skin turned black and flesh decayed, lending the name Black Death to this invisible killer. No one was safe. The plague paid no heed to age or strength, taking peasants, nobles, and clergy alike. As the sickness spread, the social fabric of villages began to unravel. Families were torn apart as loved ones succumbed one after another. The customary rituals that gave order to death, funerals, prayers, burial rites, were overwhelmed. Graveyards filled beyond capacity, and mass pits were dug hastily at the village outskirts. The church bells, once a call to worship and community, became mournful tolls that echoed the relentless passing of neighbors and kin. Fear, transformation, and enduring memory. In the midst of this chaos, fear and superstition flourished. Many peasants believed the plague was a punishment from God, a reckoning for sins committed by themselves or their communities. Some turned to fervent prayer, processions, and penance, hoping to appease divine wrath. Others sought out scapegoats, mysterious outsiders, minorities, or even neighbors accused of witchcraft or poisoning wells. This fear sometimes erupted into violence, fracturing already fragile communities. Yet, despite the overwhelming loss and suffering, the plague also transformed the very structure of medieval society. With so many dead, the balance of power between peasants and their lords shifted in subtle ways. Labor became scarce, and those who survived found themselves in greater demand. Lords, desperate to keep their lands productive, sometimes offered better terms or wages to peasants. This slow upheaval planted seeds of change, laying the groundwork for shifts that would eventually erode the rigid feudal order. But for the peasants enduring the plague, such distant political changes were of little comfort. Their world had been reduced to a daily struggle between life and death, hope and despair. The plague was not just a physical ailment but a profound wound to their communities, faith, and sense of security. It forced them to confront the fragility of their existence and the mystery of mortality in ways no famine had. As the years passed, the fields began to bloom again, and the seasons cycled as before. But the memory of the disaster lingered, like thunder on the horizon, always waiting, a reminder that life in the medieval countryside was a delicate dance on the edge of survival. The peasants, though beaten and broken, endured. Their story is one of quiet resilience amidst unrelenting hardship, a testament to the human spirit's capacity to endure even when the sky seems to fall. Dust in the light, the peasant's legacy. The story of medieval peasants is not one carved in grand monuments or penned in polished tomes. It is a tale whispered through the dust of forgotten villages, etched into the furrows of fields, and carried in the very bones beneath the soil. Their legacy is one not of glory or conquest, but of sheer survival, a testament to the quiet endurance of countless nameless lives who bore the weight of a harsh world with humble strength. As the centuries have turned, the world they knew has vanished, yet the traces of their existence remain, subtle and profound, lingering in the light that filters through history's cracks. The enduring landscape and material traces. The peasant left no grand castles or regal palaces, no gilded art or sweeping literature. What they left behind were the foundations of community itself, the villages clustered around the fields they toiled, the roads that linked them to market towns, and the patterns of cultivation that shaped the land. These landscapes, scarred and nurtured by human hands, are the most enduring monuments of their lives. The very shape of rural Europe, its patchwork of small holdings and communal fields, speaks to the centuries of peasant labor, the delicate balance they struck between nature's bounty and the demands of survival. Their homes were humble wattle and daub cottages, with thatched roofs and simple hearths. These dwellings, once bursting with life, have long since crumbled, reclaimed by wind and rain. Yet beneath the surface, archaeologists find traces, charcoal in the soil, shards of pottery, the scatter of iron tools, that piece together the rhythms of daily existence. The pottery tells of their meals, the tools speak of their work, the hearths offer glimpses of evenings spent near firelight, in the company of family and neighbors. These fragments, silent and broken, form a mosaic of life lived in uncelebrated dignity. The testimony of bones in sacred spaces. It is through their bones, too, that peasants speak across time. The skeletal remains unearthed in burial grounds reveal stories of hardship and resilience etched into flesh and bone. Many show signs of relentless labor, worn joints from endless bending, spines curved from heavy burdens, teeth worn down from coarse bread and gritty stone ground flour. Evidence of malnutrition, infections, and injuries trace the physical costs of their existence. Yet among these signs of suffering are also hints of community care, healed fractures and shared burial rites, testaments to bonds forged in adversity. The churchyard, that most sacred space in a peasant's life, was both a resting place and a symbol of hope. Though often austere, their burials connected them to the eternal, an affirmation of dignity beyond the toil of the day. The simple wooden crosses or stones marking their graves, worn by time and weather, remind us that even in death, the peasants claimed a place in the grand human story. Enduring legacy and human resilience. Beyond bones and villages, the peasants' legacy survives in the very fields they shaped. The ancient strips of land carved into open fields, the boundaries marked by hedgerows and ditches, speak to a way of life built on cooperation and shared responsibility. These fields were more than plots for growing food. They were the stage for centuries of communal labor and negotiation, where the rhythms of sowing and harvest structured the year and the lives within it. The knowledge carried by peasants, passed down orally through generations, though rarely written, profoundly shaped agricultural practices for centuries. Their understanding of the land's cycles, their subtle observations of weather and soil, and their inventive methods of crop rotation and animal husbandry laid foundations that would eventually nourish emerging societies. This folk wisdom, rooted in experience rather than theory, became the hidden engine behind Europe's slow transformation from wilderness to farmland. Though history's pages have largely forgotten the peasants, their influence quietly persists. The slow rise of towns and markets, the gradual shifts in social order, and the eventual erosion of feudal bonds all bear the imprint of the peasants' resilience and persistence. Their daily acts of survival, their small rebellions, their prayers, and their work kept the wheels of medieval society turning, often unnoticed by those who held power. Perhaps the most profound part of their legacy is the reminder of human endurance in the face of relentless hardship. The peasants' lives were marked by constraints, by lack of freedom, by poverty, by the constant threat of hunger, disease, and violence. Yet within those narrow margins, they carved out moments of joy and connection. Festivals, weddings, communal gatherings, and religious celebrations punctuated the years, offering respite and reaffirming identity. These moments, fleeting yet powerful, were the soul of peasant culture, sustaining hope and community through even the darkest times. As modern eyes gaze upon the tranquil countryside, it is easy to forget the storm of struggles that shaped it. The fields and villages seem timeless, but beneath that calm lies a history of sweat, sacrifice, and quiet heroism. The peasant's legacy is a testament to the countless lives lived without renown but with dignity, a legacy written not in grand deeds, but in the enduring rhythms of human survival. In this light, the story of medieval peasants is also a mirror held up to our own times, a reminder of the strength found in community, the importance of resilience, and the profound impact of ordinary lives. Their survival itself becomes a story worth telling, a dust in the light that continues to shine across centuries, whispering the truth of human endurance and the deep roots from which our present has grown. Summary of how medieval peasants survived life without freedom. Medieval peasants lived bound by a harsh reality, legally tied to the land, with almost no freedom or control over their lives. Their existence was shaped by the unyielding rhythms of nature, the demands of the feudal system, and a web of social and economic obligations that left little room for escape or comfort. Yet within these constraints, peasants carved out a life defined by resilience, communal bonds, and deep connections to the earth. From dawn till dusk, a peasant's day was consumed by relentless labor. They rose early to tend fields with primitive hand tools and animal plows, depending on crop rotation and seasonal cycles that governed their very survival. Farming was not just an economic activity. It was a sacred cycle intertwined with spiritual rituals and respect for nature's unpredictability. The success of a harvest could mean the difference between life and starvation. Peasant villages were small but tightly knit communities. Shared ovens, collective work, and seasonal festivals fostered a sense of belonging and mutual reliance. Family ties and neighborly cooperation were essential for survival, as no one could endure the hardships alone. Within the village, life unfolded around simple, drafty cottages where families lived amid smoke, dirt, and animals. Despite their poverty, homes were the center of warmth, storytelling, and quiet joys. Their diet reflected the scarcity that defined daily life: coarse rye bread, watery vegetable pottage, and ale instead of often contaminated water. Meat was rare and celebrated during festivals, moments when villagers momentarily escaped their monotonous toil. Hunger was a frequent companion, and every meal was a humble gift from the land and labor. Clothing was durable and patched repeatedly, signaling a person's class, gender, and season. Peasants made do with rough wool and linen, repurposing every scrap. Their garments, like their lives, bore the marks of continuous effort and limited resources. Health and mortality were grim realities. Common ailments like fevers, tooth decay, and complications from childbirth took a heavy toll. Medical care was scarce, relying on herbal remedies, wise women, and prayer rather than doctors. Death was ever present, shadowing daily life with fear and loss. Religion played a central role, offering solace and order amid uncertainty. The village church's bells marked time and ritual. Saints and feast days structured the year. Yet faith was also intertwined with fear of sin and divine punishment, reflecting the dual nature of medieval spirituality. Education, such as it was, came through oral traditions and folk wisdom. Knowledge about planting, healing, and survival passed down by word of mouth, embedding peasants deeply in their environment and culture despite widespread illiteracy. Justice was local and symbolic, often harsh and public. Manorial courts dealt with disputes, and punishments like stocks or shaming reinforced the social order. Peasants' lives were also shaped by interactions with nobility, often marked by fear, obedience, or rare moments of rebellion. Women were the unseen pillars, sustaining households through spinning, brewing, childbirth, and farm labor. Their invisible labor was vital yet undervalued, holding together family and community life. Despite their hardships, peasants found moments of joy in festivals, games, and seasonal celebrations, brief respites from toil where music, dance, and shared food brought relief. The peasant economy was fragile and barter-based, navigating taxes, tithes, and debts with few luxuries. Revolts and resistance simmered beneath the surface, rarely heroic but deeply human expressions of frustration. Catastrophes like famine, harvest failures, and the Black Death brought profound suffering, empty fields, and staggering mortality, reshaping peasant life forever. In the end, peasants' legacy is one of endurance. Though often erased from written history, their bones, villages, and fields testify to a tenacious survival. Their story is the bound earth itself, rooted in hardship, shaped by community, and bearing witness to the fragile persistence of human life without freedom. Introduction to How Medieval Peasants Survived Life Without Freedom. Today we step back into a world where life was harsh, uncertain, and bound by strict social order, yet profoundly human in its resilience. This immersive episode reveals the hidden lives of medieval peasants who lived tethered to the land and trapped in a cycle of relentless labor, poverty, and obligation. From the smoky warmth of their simple cottages, to the rhythms of planting and harvest, to the taste of coarse bread and watery pottage, every detail paints a vivid picture of survival against the odds. Explore how faith shaped their days with church bells, saints, and rituals offering both comfort and fear. Discover the vital but invisible work of peasant women, the communal joys found in fleeting festivals, and the harsh realities of sickness and death that shadowed every family. Feel the tension beneath the surface as peasants navigated justice, bartered goods, and sometimes rose in quiet rebellion. Through cinematic storytelling and slow, reflective narration, this episode brings to life the enduring spirit of those forgotten by history, ordinary people whose survival forged the very foundation of the medieval world. Join us for a journey into the past that will deepen your understanding and move your heart. Summary of how medieval peasants survived life without freedom. Medieval peasants lived bound by a harsh reality, legally tied to the land, with almost no freedom or control over their lives. Their existence was shaped by the unyielding rhythms of nature, the demands of the feudal system, and a web of social and economic obligations that left little room for escape or comfort. Yet within these constraints, peasants carved out a life defined by resilience, communal bonds, and deep connections to the earth. From dawn till dusk, a peasant's day was consumed by relentless labor. They rose early to tend fields with primitive hand tools and animal plows, depending on crop rotation and seasonal cycles that governed their very survival. Farming was not just an economic activity. It was a sacred cycle intertwined with spiritual rituals and respect for nature's unpredictability. The success of a harvest could mean the difference between life and starvation. Peasant villages were small but tightly knit communities. Shared ovens, collective work, and seasonal festivals fostered a sense of belonging and mutual reliance. Family ties and neighborly cooperation were essential for survival, as no one could endure the hardships alone. Within the village, life unfolded around simple, drafty cottages where families lived amid smoke, dirt, and animals. Despite their poverty, homes were the center of warmth, storytelling, and quiet joys. Their diet reflected the scarcity that defined daily life: coarse rye bread, watery vegetable pottage, and ale instead of often contaminated water. Meat was rare and celebrated during festivals, moments when villagers momentarily escaped their monotonous toil. Hunger was a frequent companion, and every meal was a humble gift from the land and labor. Clothing was durable and patched repeatedly, signaling a person's class, gender, and season. Peasants made do with rough wool and linen, repurposing every scrap. Their garments, like their lives, bore the marks of continuous effort and limited resources. Health and mortality were grim realities. Common ailments like fevers, tooth decay, and complications from childbirth took a heavy toll. Medical care was scarce, relying on herbal remedies, wise women, and prayer rather than doctors. Death was ever present, shadowing daily life with fear and loss. Religion played a central role, offering solace and order amid uncertainty. The village church's bells marked time and ritual. Saints and feast days structured the year. Yet faith was also intertwined with fear of sin and divine punishment, reflecting the dual nature of medieval spirituality. Education, such as it was, came through oral traditions and folk wisdom. Knowledge about planting, healing, and survival passed down by word of mouth, embedding peasants deeply in their environment and culture despite widespread illiteracy. Justice was local and symbolic, often harsh and public. Manorial courts dealt with disputes, and punishments like stocks or shaming reinforced the social order. Peasants' lives were also shaped by interactions with nobility, often marked by fear, obedience, or rare moments of rebellion. Women were the unseen pillars, sustaining households through spinning, brewing, childbirth, and farm labor. Their invisible labor was vital yet undervalued, holding together family and community life. Despite their hardships, peasants found moments of joy in festivals, games, and seasonal celebrations, brief respites from toil where music, dance, and shared food brought relief. The peasant economy was fragile and barter-based, navigating taxes, tithes, and debts with few luxuries. Revolts and resistance simmered beneath the surface, rarely heroic but deeply human expressions of frustration. Catastrophes like famine, harvest failures, and the Black Death brought profound suffering, empty fields, and staggering mortality, reshaping peasant life forever. In the end, peasants' legacy is one of endurance. Though often erased from written history, their bones, villages, and fields testify to a tenacious survival. Their story is the bound earth itself, rooted in hardship, shaped by community, and bearing witness to the fragile persistence of human life without freedom.